Welcome to the Vue Masterclass. My name is Boris Pascaver, and I'm a software engineer, consultant, educator, and author based in New York City. In this course, I'll introduce you to the popular VueJS library for building dynamic and reactive front-end interfaces. The entire course consists of one complete project that we're going to be building out together from scratch. Along the way, we're going to see how Vue helps us solve all kinds of real-world problems. In this course, we're covering not just theory, but application. So first up, what is VueJS? VueJS is a JavaScript framework for building reactive front-end interfaces. It's pronounced Vue, like mountain view or ocean view. Of course, the view that its name alludes to refers to your browser's web page, what you see when you visit a web page in your browser, such as the one that you're watching this video on right now. And what does the word reactive mean? It means that Vue enables our web page to react to change. And change comes in many forms. It may come from user events like button clicks or typing values into an input field. It may come from data that we get from some API that we need to render to the screen when it arrives. It may even come automatically. For example, we may want a message on the screen to change color every 5 seconds. These are all examples of change that happen after a web page initially loads. Vue makes it easy for our web page to seamlessly re-render itself when these changes happen without forcing a page refresh. And in the very next lesson, we'll show you the project that we're going to be building during this course, and it's going to highlight some of these changes in greater detail. Now, as far as the history of Vue, Vue was initially created by software developer Evan You, and it's since become an open source project with a global team of volunteer contributors. And its popularity continues to grow year over year. Here are 2 statistics I can provide you with. Number 1, Vue is now used by more than 1.3 million active monthly users worldwide. And number 2, from 2019 to 2020, downloads of Vue.js on Npm, which is the global JavaScript repository that stores all JavaScript packages, from 2019 to 2020, downloads of Vue doubled. So the popularity of the framework doubled in size over 1 year, and it continues to grow at an exponential rate. Okay, so here's a little bit of fun history. You might be curious, why is the library called Vue.js? Well, as it turns out, Vue creator Evan You originally wanted to call the library VueJS, V-I-E-W, but unfortunately that name was already taken on NPM. So Evan plugged the word Vue into Google Translate, and the word Vue in French is Vue, V-U-E. He liked the sound of that name, and that package name was not taken on NPM, so that's where the name comes from. It's basically a translation of the literal word Vue. All right. Next up, let's talk a little bit about the history of Vue. We're going to talk more about the differences of this library/framework in a lesson or two, but here's just a quick history to give you a sense of how this framework has matured over the last half decade. The first version of Vue, 1.0, was first published in October 2015, and the latest version, 3.0, was released in late 2020. And as I mentioned earlier, NPM downloads doubled year over year from 2019 to 2020. So it continues to grow with the release of the latest and greatest version 3.0, which we're going to be using in this course. All right, speaking of this course, what are the course prerequisites? What are the skills and technologies that you need to know in order to be successful in this course? Well, you'll need a basic knowledge of HTML and CSS to start, and you do not need to be a front-end master. You do not need to be an expert in either of these 2 technologies. You just need to know the basics. You need to understand how HTML elements work, how we nest them, and how they form the structure of a web page. You also need to know the basics of CSS, how we use it to style our HTML elements, how we can use things like selectors, how we can target HTML elements by IDs or classes, as well as your basic CSS styles, right? Now, you don't need to be an expert, and I'll be the first one to tell you that CSS is not my strong suit. We're going to do our best to make the work that we create in this course look pretty and presentable, but I'm not obsessed with CSS, and we're not going to be focused on, using the most advanced modern day features of CSS. So that should hopefully be good news to tell you that you do not need to be an expert in this either. You just need to know the basics. And the same rules apply to a knowledge of JavaScript, specifically ES6, which is the sort of modern version of JavaScript released in 2015. Now, if you're a little bit rusty on JavaScript, don't worry. Throughout the course, I have some helper videos to help remind you of the critical JavaScript concepts that you need to know to understand what we're going to be covering in the videos. But with that said, those videos are intended as refreshers, as reminders. So if you are completely unfamiliar with JavaScript, I strongly recommend that you take a JavaScript class first before you dive into learning Vue or any other front-end library for that matter. And finally, you'll need experience with your operating system and its terminal. That will be the terminal on the Mac, the command prompt or the PowerShell on the Windows, or the equivalent command line interface on your Linux machine, whatever it is that you're using. All right, and finally, to close this lesson off, I want to talk a little bit about the features of this course, what makes this course special for me, and why I think it's going to be an enjoyable experience for you. So first up, we are going to be completing a single project that covers many features of Vue, both new and old. One of my greatest frustrations with online education, and even a piece of critical feedback that I can give myself upon reflecting on some of my previous courses, is that a lot of them feel sort of not capturing what it is like to actually work with a technology in the real world. And the only real way that you'll learn how to work with Vue is to build things with it, build features with it. So the entire course from start to finish is going to be one project. And we're going to be producing real-world user features. We're going to treat this just like we're a developer on the job. We're going to have user stories. They're going to describe the user value that we're trying to add to the app. We're going to see how we can solve these problems with Vue and how Vue helps us, all right? In addition to the core Vue framework, we're also going to offer extensive coverage of the entire Vue ecosystem. So Vue actually has a bunch of supplementary tools that come available with it. You do not have to use these tools, but they're often used in tandem with Vue, and they're built by the same development team, right? And those tools include things like Vue Router for navigating from page to page in your app, as well as Vuex, which is for managing global state in your app. Now, if you're completely unfamiliar with these concepts, if this is your first time learning any front-end library, don't worry. We're going to talk about the benefits of these tools in later lessons, and we're going to introduce all of these concepts step by step. But just know you're not just getting an introduction to Vue, you're also getting an introduction to the larger ecosystem of tools that work with it. One other thing that makes this course really special is we have an extensive focus on testing, all right? This is a distinct difference, and I would estimate that probably at least 40% of the videos in this course are going to be us writing tests for the Vue code that we write. We're going to be writing tests both before we write our actual Vue code and after, and we're going to talk about the benefits of both of those approaches as we proceed. Testing is incredibly important, not just in the front end, but universally when you're writing code. It gives you a sense of security that your code does what it does. It allows you to quickly perform this kind of gut check that everything is working as expected, that you haven't broken anything. It gives you comfort when you refactor, etc. Right? I'm going to sell you more on the benefits of testing a little bit later in the course, but this is something that really isn't covered by a lot of courses, and this course will. We're going to obsess over testing and making sure that we have a great test suite. All right. And finally, the fourth benefit is some of my favorite courses that I've ever taken. I started out intending to learn a single technology, but the course was able to introduce me to an entire ecosystem of tools. And in regards to this, the ecosystem that I talk about is not just the Vue ecosystem of tools, but also the modern front-end web development landscape. What are front-end developers using today? So one of my favorite features of this course is we're going to be learning additional tools, additional technologies, additional packages like TailwindCSS, which is a popular library for styling CSS, and TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript that allows us to effectively write JavaScript, but with declaring the types that we use throughout the program. Now, if you're completely unfamiliar with Tailwind or TypeScript, that's totally fine. We talked about the prerequisites in the previous lesson. These are the technologies in this slide that you do not need to know, but that we're going to be covering. And I hope it gives you a more comprehensive, a more fun experience, because we're not just going to be focused on Vue, we're going to be focused on a lot of other things and how they work well together with Vue. All right, that's really all there is to cover in this lesson. In the very next lesson, we're going to take a look at the app we're going to be building. I hope you're excited, and I will see you there. Okay, so I am super excited to introduce the project that we're going to be building out together over this course. And it is a jobs site or a career site, and it is strongly inspired by the official Google Careers website. So first up, you can head to careers.google.com to see this site in action. and I also have it loaded right here on the screen. So there are a couple of reasons why I chose this project. First up, this website is built with VueJS, which is fitting because we're going to be solving the exact same problems that Google developers had to solve with the exact same technologies. So it is a real-world problem and a real-world website. We're not just building a sample app from scratch that has no practicality. This is a real-world project that delivered value to a real company. Secondly, this business domain is not overwhelmingly complex. It's a pretty simple website in its design. The user is able to navigate here. They're able to fill out some criteria such as a role they're interested in, or a location, or an education requirement, and then they're going to be able to see a couple jobs that fit that criteria. So the domain is simple in a sense, but there's actually also a lot of hidden complexity, and we're going to be able to learn just about every major feature of Vue simply by building out this site. This site at its core is really two pages. It's this page right here, the main page, as well as the job results page where the user actually sees the jobs, and we're going to show you that page in just a second. So as we mentioned in the previous lesson, Vue is a library for building out reactive front-end interfaces. And the word reactive means able to react to change. That change can come in many different ways. It can come automatically, it can come from a user interaction, or it can happen when the website receives new data from an API, and many other ways as well. So let's pause for a second here and think about the reactivity that we can observe in this app. Some of it is kind of prominent and in front of us, and some of it is more hidden. And then we're just going to quickly talk about some of the ways that this website is reacting to change. All right, so obviously one of the first ones that immediately jumps out at me is this content right here. Every couple seconds, this action verb right here is dynamically changing. And as a user, we're not doing anything to trigger this. It's just an automatic part of this website. At an interval, we're switching the word we see right here. Here's another example of reactivity. Even something as simple as the user typing is an event. It is something that the user is doing to the website that requires it to react. So simply by clicking into here and typing something like Vue Developer, we are interacting with this page, and Vue is going to help us to be able to react to that kind of information. You'll also notice as soon as we type that, we have this thing pop up right here, 300 jobs matched, and obviously that content is being conditionally rendered based on what we've entered here. So notice that the website is not refreshing itself, rather it is dynamically updating itself right here or right here based on user interaction, based on the passage of time, etc. But it gets even more complex than that. So here's something that is a little bit hidden. Notice that we have a main navigation menu right here, and then below it we have a sub-navigation menu. It's this section right here where we have Save Jobs and Job Alerts. Notice as well that I am logged into my Google website account. Now notice what happens when I log out. So I'm going to click this icon and I'm going to click Sign Out. Notice that the subnav disappears entirely, right? So parts of this website are being conditionally rendered based on a condition being true, based on a state. In this case, the state of whether I am logged in or logged out. Also notice as well what happened here on the right-hand side. Here we formerly had my profile image, and now we have a sign-in button. And we've accomplished that dynamic switching without reloading the whole page. So obviously what the website is thinking is if the user is logged out, give them a sign-in button, and if the user is logged in, show them their profile image. And that's the kind of reactive conditional logic that Vue is going to be able to help us build out. All right, so this is the first of two primary pages we're going to be building out. Let's now go to the jobs page and observe that. So here is the jobs page, and as you can see on the right-hand side, we're going to have a whole bunch of job listings. And as I scroll down, you're going to see as well that there are actually many different pages. Once I reach the end of this section, you'll see that we have a next button. And when I click next, once again, the page does not refresh. Rather, we simply get a fresh batch of jobs, and they're rendered right here on the screen. Which means, of course, that Vue is taking the former boxes right here and replacing them with new content without reloading the whole page. Now, of course, another big part of this page and its dynamism is this section right here where the user can filter these jobs by a variety of criteria. So notice right here, if I, for example, expand this degree section and I click on bachelor's, there's a lot of things that are going to happen. So notice here, when I click this, first up, of course, the checkbox changes, but then the jobs on the right automatically update to show only the jobs that fit this criteria. These are the jobs that require a bachelor's degree. There's another section that you may have missed. This section right here displays the total number of jobs that match the criteria. And every time I either add or remove a criteria, that number will update to reflect the correct number. So for example, if I expand this and add another filter like I'm only interested in full-time jobs, notice once again, this number updates and the jobs on the right update as well. And all of these criteria, by the way, exist simultaneously. So the logic has to be smart enough to account for the degree, the job type, any potential organization right here, the skills and qualifications, and perhaps even a text search term. And notice that almost the entire UI is reacting to a simple checkbox click. This section is changing right here. This section is changing right here, etc. So there is a lot of complexity to reveal in these two pages, and we're going to be tackling all of it and showing you how Vue helps us solve these kinds of problems in web development. Again, Vue is helping us to react to changes and dynamically update the interface with logic that we define for determining how the components of the page, the pieces, should adjust themselves as the user interacts with the page and as various events happen. All right, so this is going to be the project, and we're going to be building out just about this entire thing. It's going to look the exact same way. It's going to function the exact same way, and we're going to build out this real-world project inspired by an actual real-world Vue app built by Google developers. All right, so super exciting stuff, and I will see you in the next lesson. All right, so in this quick lesson, we'll talk about the history of Vue, as well as some new features that were introduced in its latest version, 3.0. So the first major version of Vue, 1.0, was released on October 26, 2015. So the framework itself is over half a decade old, and that is good news. That means to me that it's relatively stable and reliable, it's held up in popularity over time, and the developers have had lots of time to fix bugs, to optimize Vue for speed and efficiency, to add new features, to listen to the community and get their feedback and apply it, etc. So Vue 2.0 was released about a year later in September 2016. And when I say 1.0 or 2.0, what I'm referring to is what we call the major version numbers. The major version number refers to the number before the decimal point, so 1 or 2 or 3 in this case. In comparison, the number after the decimal point is called the minor version number. And typically the assumption we make in software, it's not always correct, but it's generally true, is that whenever there is a new major version, a new greater number before the decimal point, that version typically introduces new features or breaking changes or removes features, etc. It represents a more major change to the core library or the core framework, right? In comparison, a minor version number, for example, there were Vue versions like 2.1 and 2.2. Those typically add some smaller improvements that don't necessarily break any existing code, right? They're minor because they're not as significant, while major version changes may introduce breaking changes into your app. And the only reason I mention this is as you're working through this course and as you're building your own Vue apps, just keep in mind that upgrading, for example, from Vue 3 to Vue 4, whenever it's released, is probably going to be more significant than upgrading from Vue 3.0 to Vue 3.1, right? That's just the way it typically works in software. That's why those version numbers exist, to communicate those details to you. So Vue 3.0 was released in September 2020, so it took them 4 more years to release it. And for the most part, it really offered a bunch of quality of life improvements, but it also introduced a new way to build your Vue components, your Vue code. So let's talk about that a little bit more in this next slide. So Vue 3 was built in TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript that includes types. We're going to talk more extensively about TypeScript later in the course. And as I mentioned, Vue 3 really added a lot of quality of life improvements under the hood. So it had a decreased bundle size, which means the size of the NPM package is smaller. It rendered things faster to your browser, to your Vue, and it used up less memory on your computer. So they basically made the library faster, right? But the primary feature that Vue 3 added from a developer's perspective was something called the Composition API, and it represents a new way to build Vue components. Now, I know we haven't talked about Vue components yet, but you can think of this as just your Vue code and the syntax that it utilizes. So Vue 3 allows you to write Vue code that is completely different from the way that Vue code used to be written in Vue 2. Now, the way we used to write code in Vue 2 was called the Options API. Now here's the way it works, and this may be a little bit confusing, but is actually kind of good for this course. The composition API, the new one in Vue 3.0, does not replace the options API. Rather, it lives alongside it. So just because we're going to be learning Vue 3, because we're going to be learning the latest version, does not mean we're going to skip learning about the older Vue 2 features, the options API. That is still in the new version Vue 3. We're going to learn about both ways, both syntactical options to work with the Vue library. And of course, we're going to be learning from the latest version because it's the one that has all the features. I want to make sure I introduce you to the way things can be done now, the way things used to be done, and really, there are advantages to using the options API at some times, and there's advantages to using the composition API at other times. We're going to talk about those later in the course. But the idea is there's now two ways to write Vue code: options API, composition API. The Vue 3 version supports both of them, and we're going to be learning about both of them throughout the course. That's all there really is to cover in this lesson. In the very next lesson, which is an optional one, I want to quickly talk about the differences between Vue and other front-end libraries like React and Angular. If you're curious about that, you can check the lesson out. Otherwise, feel free to continue to the next lesson after that. See you there. In this optional lesson, I'd like to talk about the three most popular front-end libraries and frameworks in use today, which are React, Vue, and Angular, and talk about the differences between them, especially when it comes to technical development. Now, one element that makes Vue unique is that it's developed entirely by volunteers. React, whose icon you can see on the left there, is supported by Facebook, and Angular, whose icon you can see on the right here, is supported by Google, while Vue is entirely a community effort. But a better way to differentiate between these libraries is on a scale of unopinionated versus opinionated. Vue creator Evan You even stated himself that Vue falls in between React and Angular on this scale. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So let's start with the right side here, the Angular side, the opinionated side. What does it mean to be opinionated, right? Well, it means that you have opinions. It means that you have beliefs on how things should work. So Angular has a certain set of conventions, or we can also call them rules or standards, and it demands that you follow those conventions in order to use the framework effectively. A simple way that I can describe it is my way or the highway. You have to use things the way that I tell you to use them, and then if you promise me you're going to do that, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of efficiencies as a result of that. So Angular is a lot larger in scope than just Vue or React. For example, Angular automatically ships with a library to make HTTP requests, to make API requests to get data from some server. So it comes pre-configured with that. It comes pre-configured with a testing library. It enforces certain design patterns for building pieces of the app. For example, Angular requires you to write your code in TypeScript. So you're going to hear that word a lot when it comes to opinionated, right? It requires certain ways to write your code. And there's no single right way or wrong way. There's just advantages and disadvantages to each approach. So the advantage of being opinionated is that you're going to have somewhat consistent code from code base to code base. Angular wants you to do things a certain way. So if you go from one Angular code base to another, you're going to start to see the same patterns. You do have to learn more. You have a larger learning curve. For example, you have to learn TypeScript to use Angular. But once you do learn that and you move to another Angular code base, you're going to be working with the same technology, and it's used in a much more similar fashion. As I mentioned earlier, Angular chooses the HTTP request library and the testing library, but it's the same one. So you don't have to worry about picking and choosing from project to project, but you do have to learn the one way of doing things, and you kind of stick with it as you move along, right? So it has a larger learning curve up front, and it gives you less freedom, less flexibility because of its kind of standardized approach, right? So it's kind of both a blessing and a curse. The problem with opinionated software is that it's standardized and enforced. It's less fun. You're less likely to choose which technology you want to work with, how you want to do things, how you want to build things. It's Angular, it's my way or the highway, right? On the opposite end of that side, you have the unopinionated software, which is React. React, at its core, is just a Vue library. It's just responsible for rendering things in your browser. So that means it has no opinions on how you should make API requests, what API library, request library you should use, what testing library you should use. React doesn't even have an opinion on routing, which means when you navigate from one page to another in your app, how is that going to render different things on the screen? There's multiple solutions. React doesn't have an opinion on whether you should or should not use TypeScript. You can, but you don't have to. So the way to describe it is almost like the Wild West. It's kind of a free-for-all. You can mix and match a whole bunch of different libraries, whether it be testing or API requests. You can mix and match them with React. There's a lot of freedom that comes with that and a lot of flexibility, but also a lot of responsibility, because many times there's lots of competing different ways on how to do something, and you have to do extra research. You have to debate pros and cons of different solutions, and going from one React code base to another, there's not so much of a guarantee that you're going to have similar looking code. The core React code, of course, is going to be pretty similar, but the surrounding ecosystem that you surround React with is not going to have the same level of consistency as it would with an opinionated choice like Angular, right? So again, advantages and disadvantages. With the unopinionated React, you get more flexibility, you get more fun, you can play with the new library that came into fashion this year in NPM. But next year it might be replaced by a different library, and the React community may go that way and debate this way and choose this, and then all of a sudden it may not be popular anymore, and things change a lot more rapidly as a result of that. All right? So Vue kind of lines up right in the middle, and let me talk about how it's able to achieve that balance. So Vue has a very extensive ecosystem. That means there's a bunch of additional tools that are complementary to Vue, and unlike in the React ecosystem, they are built by the Vue core team, the same team that develops Vue. So Vue has a solution for routing. It's called Vue Router. We're going to be learning about it later in the course. Another example is state management, which is storing data that is global above your app, right? Vue has a solution for that called Vuex that is developed by the Vue team. If you want to test Vue components or the Vue code that we're going to be writing, Vue has a recommended test library that it develops called Vue Test Utils, again developed by the Vue core team. So what's the difference between that and Angular? Well, Vue doesn't require you to use these tools in the ecosystem, but those ecosystem tools are built with Vue in mind, specifically for working with Vue. And so when you want to expand to add those new features to your app, there is a recommended set of technologies. So you sort of get the benefits of the Angular ecosystem where you have some consistency because these are the tools that the Vue team recommends that you use and that you have in conjunction with Vue. However, there are still other options available in the open source community that work with Vue that you can also use if you're looking to try something different or had a bad experience with the way Vue does things and wants to try something else. So you sort of get the best of all worlds. You have the core Vue library, which is just like React, pretty unopinionated, but then when you want to add more features and functionalities to your app, you have a way to gradually add them to your app and know that they have the support of the Vue team behind them and thus have consistency and obviously optimizations for working with each other as you continue building out your project. So in that way, Vue sort of accomplishes the best of all worlds, and that's one of my favorite features about it. So the next slide that I'm going to take you to is from a slide deck by Evan Yu at a Vue conference that he spoke at. And it reflects sort of the entire Vue ecosystem. And of course, a lot of these terms may be pretty unfamiliar to you, but the way it works is like this. You can imagine that this bright red circle right here that says Declarative Rendering really is the core heart of what the Vue library gives you. And I would also say the component system around it as well. So this red circle here is what's kind of the core Vue library. If you just install Vue, this is what you're going to get. And these are additional features that are commonly needed in modern front-end web apps, right? So the Angular approach, of course, is giving you all of these features in the single Angular framework and saying you have to use it. You have to use our solution for client-side routing. You have to use our large-scale state management solution, etc., our build system, etc. React's solution is to say, well, I'm going to give you this red circle, and it's up to you to figure out how you want to handle all of these other elements. There's a bunch of different solutions and options. Choose which one works. And of course, there's a lot of inconsistency thus from React codebase to React codebase. What Vue says is we're going to just give you this core part, and if you're interested in these other features, we're going to build them and we're going to make them optional. So you're not required to add them like Angular does, but if you want to add them, you can, and you can add them with the confidence that they are going to work well with Vue because they're developed by the exact same team. Right? React doesn't have that comfort because the core React library is developed by Facebook, but all of its additional supplemental libraries in its ecosystem are developed by a whole bunch of different teams, some open source, some from other companies, etc. So it's a lot more fragmented, right? You're probably going to get a lot more innovation there, a lot more competition, etc., but a lot more consistency as well. And Angular, on the other end, is a total opposite. It's, we're going to give you all of this. You choose. If you don't want it, then Angular is not the right thing for you. Vue, in comparison, kind of, again, merges the best of all worlds. It gives you this option, which is the core Vue library. It gives you the options for anything beyond that, including the Vue recommended approach or the Vue supported approach developed by the core team, or your choice of whatever open source libraries that you'd like to use if you prefer something different. Right? So that's kind of the differences between Vue, React, and Angular. Hopefully that's helped to clarify that opinionated versus unopinionated scale and probably given you a better sense of which one you should pick for your project or for your team as you're building your next app. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, and now we can move forward with officially installing Vue and getting started with the framework. Okay, so the first dependency that we will need to install will be a web browser. And in this course, I will be using the Google Chrome browser by Google. This is still the most popular browser used in the world. I believe it has something like 65% market share. So it is a popular, modern, up-to-date choice with frequent updates. So I encourage you to use the Google Chrome browser for this course. However, you are more than welcome to go with another browser if you prefer, such as Firefox, Safari, Opera, etc. All right, so if you want to install Chrome, you can head to google.com/Chrome in your browser and then click Download Chrome, and that will give you an installer that is specific to your operating system, whether it be Mac, Windows, or Linux. Once you get that installer, of course, you can follow the instructions in that installer file to walk through the installation. All right, you're obviously watching this course on a browser now, so I hope this is not your first time experiencing a web browser. But of course, if you're unfamiliar with Chrome, this is a pretty good, solid, modern option, and this is what I'm going to be utilizing throughout the course. All right, so go ahead and install that if you want, and I will see you in the next lesson. All right, so our VueJS project is fundamentally a JavaScript project, and JavaScript projects run on the Node runtime environment. If you're unfamiliar, Node is the software that allows us to run JavaScript outside of our web browser. And with Node, we're able to do things like use JavaScript as our backend language, use JavaScript to process files in our computer, to transpile files, to put a Vue app together, etc. It treats JavaScript like any other programming language in the world, like Java or Python or Ruby. It allows us to work with this JavaScript language outside of the confines of what JavaScript does, just in the browser. So we're going to need to install Node on our computer. So in order to do that, you should head to nodejs.org, and it should automatically detect your operating system, whether that be Mac or Windows or Linux. And on the front page, you'll be able to download a version of Node for your operating system. You might see two available download options here, the LTS option and the current option. I recommend downloading the LTS option. LTS stands for long-term support, and this is sort of the more stable version of Node that has been around for some time, that has had the chance to have bugs fixed and new features added and worked on and tested over some time. The current one is more of the latest cutting edge one, but that's not necessarily what we want in this case. We want the more stable version over the most modern one. So I recommend downloading the LTS version. If the numbers in front of it are different, that's totally fine. Just look for the button to download the LTS version of Node. At that point, you'll be able to download the file to your computer. It may be different depending on your operating system. For me, on a Mac, it's a PKG file, and then just double click that installer and follow the instructions in it to install Node on your computer. That's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one. All right, so in this lesson, I want to customize a configuration setting for our Jest testing library. And the settings for this library are going to be found in a single file at the top level of our job search project. It is this file right here, Jsconfig.js. And if you open this file, you'll see that it consists of a basic JavaScript object with a preset property. Now, what I want to add to this object, which of course is the settings for Jest, what I want to add to this object is going to be a new test match property. And in the previous lesson, in that article, I provided the direct property and its value. So you can go ahead and copy that directly over. So I'm going to do that on my end right here, paste it below, and then I just want to take a quick couple seconds to describe exactly what is going on here. So what this property sets is the file extensions that Jest is going to look for when it's trying to determine the test files in our project. So for example, right here in our tests directory, if you expand that, you'll see that we have a sample test file and it is called example.spec.js. Now by default, the Vue CLI configures Jest so that it only looks for test files with a .spec.js extension. And that is totally fine, but another common convention that you'll see across JavaScript code bases is test files that end with .test.js. So there is no option that is inherently better. It really is a matter of personal choice and consistency ultimately in your team's code base. However, what this setting that we added will do is it will recognize either option, either .spec.js or .test.js. What this actually is an array of regex. Regex is short for regular expressions, and a regular expression is just a search pattern for text. So you don't need to understand all this complexity, but right here you can see we are designating that the file can have either spec or test in its name. That's basically all that we are configuring here. All right, and that's all the Jest configurations that we need to do for this course. So that's all there is to cover in this lesson, and I will see you in the next one. All right, so in the previous lesson, we installed the Vue CLI, and so now let's use it to create our Vue project. So navigate to the directory on your computer where you want to create the project, and then as I mentioned in the previous lesson, we're going to begin with the Vue command, followed by a subcommand, and what we're looking for here is create. What Vue create will do for us is create a brand new Vue application. The only thing we need to provide after this is going to be our project name, and I'm going to call this project job-search. All right, so go ahead and press enter here, and what this will launch is a prompt where we are going to be able to configure some of the settings in our project. So for example, this first screen allows us to pick a preset, and a preset is a combination of existing tools. Basically, if we want to have a simple selection of just a combination of tools, for example, in this first one, Vue 3 with Babel and Eslint, we can press enter right here, and with just one click, Vue CLI will assume a reasonable set of defaults and create a basic default Vue 3 project. And the second option does the exact same thing for a Vue 2 project. Now, the option that I actually want to select here is going to be this last one, manually select features, because I want to walk through all of the configuration settings and talk about the actual technologies that we're going to be choosing and what we're going to be doing with them. So let's select a third option. You can use your arrow keys to navigate and then press enter to choose your option. And so here, for example, we're going to be able to select all of the features that we want in our project. The way this works is we use the arrow keys to navigate up and down, and then we use the spacebar to select a feature that we would like to include in the app. So for now, the only feature that I want to add is going to be unit testing. So navigate down to this and press the spacebar. And unit testing is going to set up our Vue project with the foundation for unit testing, which means running tests that validate that our code and our Vue components do what they are supposed to do. We're going to talk more about the proper syntax and the logic behind testing later. For now, just realize this is a feature that I want to have in my app. So I'm going to select it right here and press enter. All right, the next option is going to be selecting the version of VueJS that we want to work with. In this case, we're going to go with 3.x. And as a reminder, the version 3 has all of the features of version 2 plus additional ones. So we're not losing out anything by learning the most modern version. We're still going to learn a lot of old Vue concepts and the new ones as well. So choose 3.x here. Next up, we're going to be asked to select a linter and a formatter, and these are two very similar technologies, but they're a little bit different. So let's take a brief second to describe what each of them does. So a linter is a program that's going to analyze your code and look for errors or violations. So what I mean by errors or violations is certain code smells in your code or certain bits of code that indicate a likelihood for error or inefficiency. So a very simple example is if you import some kind of function from another file, but you never invoke it, that's something that is unused and probably useless. And Eslint, which is an example of a linter, is going to be able to isolate and identify those errors and also make recommendations on how to fix them. So linters are concerned with technical perfection, if you will, right? Identifying errors, identifying optimizations, and the like. It deals with the quality of the code. A formatter, in comparison, is only concerned with the aesthetics of the code, which means how it looks. So a formatter is going to look through your code and reformat the file so that it looks standardized and has a conventional format. So a simple example of what a formatter can do in JavaScript is add a semicolon at the end of each line. So different formatters, such as Prettier, have their own preferred conventions. And when you choose a formatter, you're basically saying, I'm going to trust that a whole bunch of other developers have thought about the best way to format JavaScript code and Vue code and HTML code, and I'm going to let this program run through my file and reformat it so it looks pleasing and is standardized, so that all the developers working on the code base will have a file that looks similar, or across the entire code base, that is, files that look similar to each other, so that each developer's own personal preferences doesn't lead to a wide range of different styles across the code base, right? So once again, a linter is dealing with technical violations, and a formatter is simply dealing with how the code looks. Eslint, in this case, is going to be our linter, and Prettier is going to be our formatter. And we're going to talk more about how these technologies express themselves in VS Code a little bit later in the course. But for now, we can choose which combination we want, and we want to go down here to Eslint and Prettier. All right, the next option is going to ask us when we want to actually lint our code. And again, lint means simply to run Eslint to look for those violations. This isn't going to be particularly important because VS Code will tell us automatically when there is a violation, but this also gives us an additional option to lint when we save the file, as well as lint and fix whenever we make a git commit. It doesn't really matter what we choose here, so let's just choose lint on save. Then, remember earlier when we were selecting the features for the app, we added unit testing? There's actually a variety of JavaScript libraries in the NPM ecosystem that can do that job of unit testing. So this is simply asking us to choose between two popular options, Jest versus Mocha and Chai. So I'm going to choose Jest here. Jest is a very popular solution. It is open source and actually developed by Facebook. And that's kind of good because it has a reliable development team and funding behind it. It's also modern, up to date. And quite honestly, it's the one I know best, so I can probably teach it best. So for all those reasons, we're going to be choosing Jest right here. All right, next thing, it's going to ask us where we want to place our configuration files. So all of the technologies that we've chosen, for example, Eslint, Prettier, Jest, they may have their own configuration files where we can customize their settings. And we can either store those settings centrally in our project's package.json file, which exists in any node project, or we can create separate configuration files for all of these different technologies and libraries. I, of course, prefer to break things up so things are a lot easier to understand because they're spread out. So for this option, I'm going to select in dedicated config files. Finally, if you want to save this combination of options as its own preset, very similar to the presets we saw on the very first screen, you can do that. And of course, that is helpful for if you're working on a team where you have a bunch of Vue projects and you want to maintain consistency between those code bases. For us, we're only going to be working with one project the entire course, so it doesn't really matter. So for this, I'm going to select N for no, then press the Enter key, and that will start the process of initializing the Vue project. So the Vue CLI is going to create a folder with the exact same project name as we gave. So right here we can see job search, and then it's also going to fetch all the dependencies it needs to launch the app. So it's going to get Vue, it's going to get Babel, which is going to do the transpilation, it's going to get Jest for unit testing, Eslint for linting, it's going to get Prettier for beautification, and then it's going to create the basic required set of files that it's going to need in this folder in order for our Vue code or our Vue app to be completely runnable. So as we're going to see in the very next lesson, when we run this app, we literally are going to have to execute just one more command after this, and this CLI will give us all of the required files we need to have a basic, simple Vue app running in the browser with all of these additional configurations, such as unit testing, baked in. So this entire process right here can take up to a minute or a couple minutes. As you can see here, it's kind of moving right along, but taking a little bit of time. And at the very end, it's going to kind of bring you back to the terminal and give you instructions for how to navigate into the directory as well as launch the project. So now that we have successfully created the job search project, we can go ahead and launch this Vue application in the very next lesson. I'll see you there. All right, so in the previous lesson, we created our job search Vue app. Our next step is to show this app in our web browser. And the output right here tells us exactly how to do that. We have to navigate into our job search folder, and this is a command that you should write down or memorize, become very familiar with. Npm Run Serve is going to be the command that runs the Vue app in our browser. So let's go ahead and navigate into our directory with the cd command and run npm run serve. This process can take up to a couple seconds. It has to build up all the files, transpile them, which we talked about earlier. That's the process where Babel is going to take our Vue code and convert it to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that the browser can understand. But when it's done, you're going to see this message compiled successfully, and it's going to give you a port on localhost, which is your computer, where you can access this app. Now, normally what this should do is open up a web browser with the app. And if you see that, that's great. If it doesn't do that, then what you can do is open up your web browser of choice, in my case, Chrome, and simply navigate to this URL in the browser, and you should see the app. So let me do that right here. I'm going to drag over my Google Chrome web browser from the other screen. And right here, right in the URL bar, I'm going to follow this path right here, localhost :8080. So localhost :8080, and that's going to take you to your Vue app. And welcome, this is a running Vue app in our browser. Welcome to your VueJS app, and it's going to provide you, of course, with links to the Vue CLI documentation. It's going to tell you about some of the plugins that it automatically installed for you, some essential links to check out, the ecosystem of Vue, which we talked about earlier. Those are some of the related tools that are developed by the Vue team that we're going to be working with a little bit later in the course. But this is a running Vue app, right? That's it. That's all there really is to cover in this lesson. If you see this, then everything is set up successfully, and we are all clear to start exploring the code that powers the web page that you see right here. I'll see you in the next lesson. All right, so I now have my terminal and my Vue app side by side up and running. So the next thing I want to do is open our text editor, which is going to be Visual Studio Code. So right here, I'm going to open up a new tab. In Mac, you can press Command+T to open up a new tab. Basically, I just need a new terminal window, and by default, my Mac will place me in the same folder that I was just in. If you are on another operating system and it takes you to another folder, just go ahead and navigate back to where you have job search on your computer. And here we can execute code, followed by a space and a dot in order to open Visual Studio Code in the current directory. So that's going to open up our job search project in VS Code. I'm going to drag it over from my other screen and keep it on the left here. And I'm going to remove this welcome pane. So we're going to dive into all of these Vue files and everything that Vue CLI created for us in just a moment. But in this lesson, I want to show you the concept of hot reloading. Hot reloading basically means we can make changes in our code editor, and the Vue CLI will automatically recognize that we've made those changes. It will interpret them, and it will transpile them, and it will refresh the web page that you see on the right to reflect those changes. So we don't have to restart our server. We don't have to worry about telling Vue which files have changed. It is smart enough to figure that out and make the development process easier for us by auto-refreshing for us, which is a feature called hot reloading. So again, we're going to worry about the files that we have here on the left in just a second. For now, I want to use a VS Code feature to search for a file. And to search for a file by name, we can press Command-P on Mac OS or Control-P on Windows. And that's going to bring up this little box. And here you can enter any file name. And I'd like to search for a file here called app.vue. And here it is. So I'm going to open this file up. This is an example of a Vue file. All right. Now, you don't have to worry about any of the logic or syntax in here. We're going to talk about it over the course of the next many, many hours. But I do want you to notice here that we have this text, welcome to your VueJS app, right here. And you'll notice that that is the exact same text that you have right here on the right in Chrome. And as you might guess, this is the string that affects this output. So what I want to do here is replace this text with something else, save this file, and then we'll immediately see the changes reflected in our browser. So it doesn't matter what we put here as long as it's something different. So I'm just going to put a fun string of I'm learning Vue. And let's add an exclamation point because we're super excited. Right now our file isn't yet saved. We can tell in VS Code because we have this little white dot on our tab with the file name. But once we save the file, which we can do with Command S on a Mac or Control S on Windows, then the file will save, Vue CLI will register the change, transpile, and automatically you can see the changes on your right-hand side right here. All right, here's another example. Let me do hello world right here. Hello world, save that, and within a second, it automatically reflects on the right-hand side. Right? So Vue makes the appropriate changes, no refresh is required, and this is an example of what Vue CLI gives us out of the box. We don't have to hardwire this Webpack logic under the hood. It just takes care of this kind of convenience for us. All right, so that's all hot reloading is, and in the next lesson, we'll start configuring VS Code to have some optimizations to work with our Vue project. So I'll see you there. Okay, so over the course of the next couple of lessons, we're going to configure a lot of project settings. In this lesson, we're going to start out by configuring our VS Code settings. Then in the next lesson, we'll configure a little bit of Jest. Jest, as a reminder, is our test runner. And finally, we'll configure a little bit of Eslint. And Eslint, as a reminder, is our linter, which checks for violations in our code. So before we begin with this lesson, I just want to confirm with you that you have installed the 3 required VS Code extensions that you'll need to work in this course. So if you haven't, make sure you go to this extensions panel right here and install the following 3 extensions. Vetur is the first one, V-E-T-U-R. Then Eslint is going to be the second one. That's this one right here from Microsoft. And finally, Prettier is going to be the third. And you need to make sure that those extensions are installed because otherwise the settings that we're going to enable are not going to work. Okay, so let's now create some settings for our project. And these settings are mostly going to configure how VS Code is going to work. So in VS Code, you can use the following shortcut. On a Mac, it's going to be Command-Shift-P. And on a Windows, it's going to be Control-Shift-P. And that's going to bring up the command palette. It's this little box right here where we can issue instructions to VS Code. And I want you to search for settings. And you should be able to find a setting like this. It says Preferences Open Workspace Settings, the first one that's highlighted. And if you press enter, it should launch you into the screen where you can set a bunch of options for VS Code. Now you'll notice at the top that there are 2 tabs, User and Workspace. User refers to global user settings. That means if you set the settings in here, they will apply to any project, or in other words, any directory that you open in VS Code. In comparison, workspace settings right here apply only to this project, in this case, our job search project. So to make sure that I don't accidentally override any of your global user settings, make sure that you click on workspace, and that will ensure that the changes we make here are only going to apply in this project. All right, so here are some of the things we're going to add to help enhance how VS Code helps us write our code. The first thing I want to search for here is Format on Save. And you're going to see right here, there's an option on their editor for formatting and save. And what this is going to allow us to do is to automatically run Prettier, our formatter, whenever we save a file. And that, of course, makes it super easy to automatically format our code. Now you'll notice as soon as I put a check mark here, we're going to get a brand new folder created here called .vscode. And in here, we're going to have a single settings.json file. If I were to open that file, you'll see we have this one key, editor.formatOnSave set to true. And as you can probably guess, this is simply the JSON setting representation of the visual setting we enabled here. So every single setting that we choose right here is being saved inside the settings.json file. So you can always edit your settings right here if you want to, but if they're also able to be edited from the user interface, that's obviously a lot easier because you don't have to remember the name of the settings. Keep in mind, as we adjust every setting that we're about to adjust, each one will add a new line to the settings.json file. That's totally fine. All right, so we know we're going to format each file when we save it. The next question, of course, is what are we going to format it with? Because there are a variety of programs that can format our code. So right here, if you search for formatter, you're going to see this first option pop up called Default Formatter. And here's where we can tell VS Code what we would like to format the code with. And if I select this drop down, you're going to see a whole bunch of options. And of course, we want to select Prettier right here. Now keep in mind, if this option is not appearing for you, it's probably because you do not have the Prettier extension installed. So make sure you do have that installed and this should pop up. So click Prettier right here and that will take care of that. The next thing I want to search for is going to be tab size. Typically in JavaScript projects, a common tab size is going to be 2. So I'm going to replace this 4 with a 2 and press enter. And then I can go back to settings.json to verify that everything is working as expected. So I have 3 rules right here. The next two rules I'm going to add, we're going to write inline because there is no visual interface where we can accomplish this, but they should be pretty simple. So right here, after your last key value pair, you can place a comma, and the logic for the next rule is going to be the same. So we're going to have a key here, which is going to be a string, and our key is going to be eslint.validDate. And what this is going to be an array where we tell Eslint, our linter, what types of files we want it to lint. And again, the word lint means look over for errors and violations and things like that. So we're going to put two strings in this array. The first one is going to be a string of JavaScript, all lowercase. So we're telling it to lint all JavaScript files. And then finally, we will also say Vue because we want Eslint to also apply to our Vue files, which we'll talk more about later. Finally, the last setting I want to add is to address a bug that I have seen while working with the Vue CLI and its configurations. I've noticed that sometimes Prettier doesn't work perfectly on JavaScript files. It kind of skips the beautification of them when we save. So what we can do here is add a little bit more of a custom precise setting. It's going to be very similar to what we have on line 3, but I'm going to also explicitly tell VS Code that for all JavaScript files, I also want the default formatter to be Prettier. My hope, of course, is that this line number 3 applies to all types of files in my code base because Prettier can work on JavaScript files and Vue files and HTML, but for some reason on my end, I found that it sometimes skips JavaScript files, so I want to add a second rule that's going to be very similar to this one. Basically, the way it's going to work is like this. I'm going to create a new rule, and so in here, in double quotes, I'm going to say JavaScript, and make sure you wrap JavaScript in square brackets. And basically this is saying I'm going to make a rule here for just files that have JavaScript inside them, or JavaScript files. To that, I'm going to attach an object, and here inside that object, I'm going to copy the exact same line I have on line 3. So I'm just going to literally copy and paste this thing right here. So basically what I'm saying is make Prettier my default formatter, and also make Prettier my default formatter for all JavaScript files. So this category, again, on line 3, should in theory encompass this category, but for some reason it didn't for me, and this was a solution that helped solve the problem for me. All right, so go ahead and save that. And the good news is you don't have to ever touch this file again in this project. We have enabled a bunch of these settings to help us write our code, automatically format it on save, set the default tab size so we never have to worry about it again, make sure that Eslint validates our JavaScript and Vue files. And so with these settings, we're now going to get all these benefits and we never have to worry about it again. If for some reason you see any issues with the JSON in here, for example, your editor is complaining, keep in mind in the previous lesson, I've provided a bunch of sample code that you can copy and paste. It's going to be this object right here. So you can simply copy and paste that content directly into your settings.json file, and that JSON blob that I provided should work. Just in case you've created a typo here or something like that, it's a way that you can always return back to a working state. All right, so that is our settings for the VS Code editor. In the next lesson, we'll take a look at modifying our settings for the Jest test runner. I'll see you there. All right, so in this lesson, I want to customize a configuration setting for our Jest testing library. And the settings for this library are going to be found in a single file at the top level of our job search project. It is this file right here, Jsconfig.js. And if you open this file, you'll see that it consists of a basic JavaScript object with a preset property. Now, what I want to add to this object, which of course is the settings for Jest, what I want to add to this object is going to be a new test match property. And in the previous lesson, in that article, I provided the direct property and its value. So you can go ahead and copy that directly over. So I'm going to do that on my end right here, paste it below, and then I just want to take a quick couple seconds to describe exactly what is going on here. So what this property sets is the file extensions that Jest is going to look for when it's trying to determine the test files in our project. So for example, right here in our tests directory, if you expand that, you'll see that we have a sample test file and it is called example.spec.js. Now by default, the Vue CLI configures Jest so that it only looks for test files with a .spec.js extension. And that is totally fine, but another common convention that you'll see across JavaScript code bases is test files that end with .test.js. So there is no option that is inherently better. It really is a matter of personal choice and consistency ultimately in your team's code base. However, what this setting that we added will do is it will recognize either option, either .spec.js or .test.js. What this actually is an array of regex. Regex is short for regular expressions, and a regular expression is just a search pattern for text. So you don't need to understand all this complexity, but right here you can see we are designating that the file can have either spec or test in its name. That's basically all that we are configuring here. All right, and that's all the Jest configurations that we need to do for this course. So that's all there is to cover in this lesson, and I will see you in the next one. In this lesson, I want us to configure our Eslint settings. As a reminder, Eslint is our linter. It's a piece of software that's going to look at our code, both the JavaScript code and the Vue code, and it's going to look for violations. And violations could mean anything from errors or even things like not following best practices when it comes to efficient code, optimal code, etc. So to summarize, Eslint is going to make our code better by identifying areas of improvement in our existing code. And the settings for Eslint are found in this file at the top level of our job search project. It's this one right here, eslintrc.js. So go ahead and open this file up. And the first thing I want you to focus your eyes on is this extends key right here. It's set to an array of strings. And each one of these strings specifies a plugin. A plugin is just a collection of rules, and there are various rules depending on the technologies that we work with. So for example, this first plugin, Vue 3 Essential, is rules specifically related to Vue code. In comparison, this second one on line 8, Eslint recommended, is general Eslint rules for JavaScript. Remember, these are different pieces of technology, so there are different rule sets for each. And it is in this extends array that we specify which combinations of rules we want Eslint to be following when it analyzes our code. So here's what I want to show you, and you do not need to follow along with this, but I'm going to open up a sample Vue file in our app, and it's called Hello World. And I'm going to drag it over here to the right, and you do not need to understand everything that's going on in this file because we have not talked about any Vue concepts yet. That's totally fine, but I just want to show you an example, and it will demonstrate how Eslint works for us. So you'll notice this first rule right here, Vue 3 Essential, is currently in place, and there are no violations right here in this file. What I want to do here is I want to change this to be another collection of rules that's going to be more stricter. So this is something you should follow along with. Go ahead and open up your Eslint file, and here change this from Vue 3 Essential to Vue 3 Recommended. And that's how you spell recommended. And what this rule set is going to do is it's going to look not just for the essential Vue violations, which means the things that are most likely to be errors. It's also going to look for things that are optimizations or best practices in the Vue community. So the reason I want to go with the more stricter set of rules here is because I want these rules to pop up as we build our code throughout the course so we can talk about why we have these best practices, what problems or optimizations they're designed to solve. So while the default configuration that Vue CLI gave us is okay, I want to go with the harder one. I want to go with the stricter one because it's going to offer us more opportunities to learn. So let me show you this as an example. I'm going to save this file, and immediately Eslint is going to rerun and analyze our code. And I want you to focus your eyes on this section in this file right here. I'm going to save right now, and you'll notice in just a second we're going to see this orange squiggly appear in this component or in this file on the right hand side. And if I hover my mouse over this, you're going to see the Eslint violation pop up. It says prop MSG requires default value to be set. Now, right now, it's not important to understand exactly what this violation is or how we fix it. The point that I'm trying to make is that this collection of rules in the recommended plugin is a lot more stricter, and that's why this rule appeared right here, while it formerly did not when we had just the essential plugin. So that's the only change we made here. We've enabled more stricter settings so that we can talk through these violations, how to fix them, and why they matter throughout the course. So this is the first change that I'd like you to make. The second change is going to be in this file section right here. And in order to provide the content right here, what I'd like you to do is to open up your Jsconfig file that we modified a lesson or two ago. So I'm going to use Command P on a Mac, and I believe on Windows it's going to be Control P. And you can look for that Jsconfig.js file. It's found at the top level of your project. And I want you to copy this array of two strings that belongs to the test match key. So I'm just going to copy this array right here. And right here in the Eslint file, in the override section, you'll notice this object has a files property set to an array. I want you to take that array and I want you to replace it with the one you just copied from the Jsconfig file. So I'm going to do that right here, and that's what we want to do. All right. So once again, what this is going to do is it's going to tell Eslint what our test files look like. It's going to tell Eslint that our test files can have either a .spec.js extension or a .test.js extension. And that's an important point worth noting here, and that is that Eslint is going to look for violations not just in our source code, in our implementation code, but also in our test files, right? Because a violation is a violation no matter where we write it. If it is our code and we could write it better, Eslint should be watching out for it and making its recommendations. I also want to show you that at this point, Prettier should be fully enabled, and I can show that to you in our Eslint rc.js file. So what I can do here, by the way, as an example, is I'm just going to move line 8 right here to the previous line. And you can see it kind of gives this awkward syntax where we have 2 strings on one line and then 1 string on the next. It kind of becomes harder to read. And as soon as I save this file, Prettier will click in and it's going to reformat the file. And as soon as I save, you can see Prettier's preference is to have each array element on a single line, or at least when the array is super long, that's its preference. And you'll see that will automatically reformat even this Eslint configuration file. And it's going to do the exact same thing for our regular JavaScript, our Vue code, our test code, etc. And that is the beautiful part of Prettier. We only configure it once, and then it starts using its best practices to format our code in a really beautiful manner. All right, so that's the only 2 things we need to do in this file. Make sure you change this from Vue 3 essential to Vue 3 recommended, and make sure that the files array is set to the exact same array of strings as in our just.config file. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one. Okay, so in this lesson, we'll talk about our project structure. So I quickly want to walk through all of the files and folders that Vue CLI generated for us at a very high level. So here on the left-hand side, I have my Project Explorer open, and let's walk through these files one by one. So of course, at the very top, we have our VS Code folder, and in here we have our settings JSON file. It's in this file that we have our project-specific settings, and this is mostly configuration for our text editor itself. It doesn't specifically have to deal with Vue. Afterwards, we have our node modules directory. This, of course, is where we have all of our dependencies. So all of the NPM packages that are specified in package.json are installed here, as well as their sub-dependencies. So it is here that we have Vue and Eslint and Prettier and Babel, etc. As a quick reminder, in case you are unfamiliar with the node ecosystem, you typically should not include your node modules directory in your Git commits, because this is supplementary external code that is outside of our project. And the expectation is that you should only commit your own code, and that when somebody downloads your repository, they can simply run npm install to create their node modules folder automatically. So you should never commit node modules to source control. And in addition, you should generally not edit any content in here, because again, all of these libraries are other people's code and you don't want to mess them up. You only want to focus on the code that you have control over. Moving right along, we have our public folder right here, and the only file of interest in this one is index.html. And if I open this up, this is actually going to be the index.html file that our browser loads whenever the Vue app starts up. And as you can see, it is pretty lightweight. It is pretty bare bones. So this is the heart of a single page application. The page begins as a very simple HTML page. We can see here there's actually just one div in the body. And the idea is that JavaScript or Vue handle all of the actual updates we see on the screen. So the addition of new elements, the removal of existing elements, the swapping of elements, the changing of styles, all of that is handled by JavaScript. And it is in this div right here where we sort of inject or mount our Vue application. So our Vue application tracks all of those changes, and it simply plugs into the HTML right here, and then JavaScript takes over fully. So our JavaScript file predictably is going to be a lot larger than our index.html file. Our index file is very small because it's just the bare infrastructure that is needed to load the JavaScript and have it inject the Vue application in here. All right, and that's the whole point of a single page application, is we don't need to keep refreshing the page and getting fresh HTML. Rather, the JavaScript bundle includes all the logic that it needs to know how to navigate the user across different pages, how to remove certain things and add certain things, and it takes care of it automatically. But this is where it all begins. This is the HTML file that your browser loads whenever we look at our Vue app at localhost 8080 in our browser. All right, moving right along, we have our src or source directory, and this is where we're going to be writing 95% of the code in this class. This is basically where we're going to have all of our Vue-related code and our JavaScript code. So most of our code is going to go in here. After src, we have the tests directory, and this is where we're going to be writing our tests files, and those are going to validate that our implementation files in src are doing as they are supposed to do. So we're going to double check that our code is working as expected. We'll talk more about that later. And this is not necessarily the only convention. Sometimes people put their tests alongside their direct implementation in the src directory. So this folder structure is not something that is mandated by Vue, but it's a common one where you place your tests in a separate tests directory at the top level. It really is a matter of personal preference and consistency, but following the way that Vue CLI has set up our code, we are going to be writing all of our test files within this tests directory on the top level of the project. All right, and those are all of our directories, and we still have a couple configuration files remaining, so let's quickly walk through those. So browsers list RC is just a kind of a requirements file for the transpiler so that it knows what versions of browsers it has to support. So for example, right here, this says that you don't have to worry about IE 11, Internet Explorer 11. Basically, this is a file that we never have to really worry about when we're working on our project, but in case you have to verify support for older browsers, remember that we're going to be taking the Vue code and we're going to be transpiling it to basic JavaScript that can run in a browser, and certain browsers will support certain features and certain ones will not. So this is the file that sort of tells the transpiler what it can work with, and that allows it to both include and exclude certain browsers that it needs to have, and that affects how it transpiles the code and what JavaScript it ends up creating as a result, right? So we never have to really worry about it, but if you're working with a product that needs to support legacy users on legacy browsers, this is the kind of place where you might make those changes to support those older browsers, all right? We don't ever have to worry about this file again. Afterwards, we have, of course, our Eslint RC.js file. This is our configuration file for the Eslint linter. We modified basically this line a lesson or two ago, and we don't really have to worry about this file moving forward as well. Afterwards, of course, we have our Git Ignore file. This is where you can specify any files or folders that you would like Git to ignore permanently, so it will never be committed to source control. So one example here, of course, is our node modules directory. So this will never be included when you make a Git commit. And you can, of course, put all kinds of random files that don't really matter here if you don't want them to be included in your source control. All right, Babel Config Js just configures some things that Babel needs in order to transpile our Vue code. Once again, it's a configuration file. We don't really need to worry about it, but it does need to stay in the project. Same thing goes for Jest. This is our configuration for our Jest test runner. We added this line right here a couple lessons ago, and we never really have to worry about this file again. All right, Jsconfig.json here sets up some basic JavaScript logic, basically communicating some of the logic of the type of version that we're trying to get to in JavaScript ES5. Things like establishing the src directory as the kind of the home or root directory. Once again, these are just compiler options for transpilation. We don't really need to worry too much about customizing the values here because the Vue CLI sets up a reasonable default for us to work with. All right, finally, of course, we have package JSON. This is where we have all of our project dependencies. So as I scroll down, you can see here is my version of Vue. We also have our dev dependencies listed below. And as a reminder, dev dependencies are packages that we don't need for the end user in the browser. They solely exist for the benefit of us, the developer. So for example, prettier right here is really great for formatting our code, but for the end user, they don't really care. They're not looking for our code in the browser. They're not looking for that. Another example is Jest, which is our test runner. Tests are very important to verify that our code works, but it makes no difference to the end user using our website. So these dev dependencies are strictly for us as developers, while these dependencies are the actual NPM packages that Vue needs in order to run in the browser. As another quick reminder about the NPM ecosystem, we have this script section right here. And the way this works is in your terminal, you can run the command npm run followed by any one of these keywords, and that will correspond to the command on the right-hand side. So for example, earlier we ran npm run serve, and that launched our Vue app in the browser. The reason we were able to run serve after npm run is because it is an available key right here. So we can similarly do npm run build, npm run test : unit, npm run lint, and when we run those commands from the terminal, they execute these commands right here. And of course, these commands simply rely on the Vue CLI service, which we installed to run a whole bunch of internal commands to start up that process, whether it be serving the app live in the browser, building the final JavaScript bundle, running our Jest test suite, or linting the files with Eslint and Prettier. All right. And then we have, of course, our README. This is just a plain markdown file where you can write a description about your app. This is typically where developers will show you how to set up the repository on your computer. We're not going to be writing any documentation in this course, so we don't need to worry about it. But if you want to use this file to keep notes, that's a good place to do it. And finally, VueConfig.js is just a general configuration file for the Vue CLI. We're never going to have to deal with this file again, but there are some configuration options available depending on how you would like to transpile the Vue app. Once again, for learning the basics of Vue, all of the defaults that Vue CLI created for us here are pretty reasonable, so we're going to stick with them throughout the course. All right, so that is a quick overview of the project structure, and I will see you in the next lesson. All right, so in this lesson, I want to talk a little more about how our Vue app is mounted in the browser. In the previous lesson, we explored the index.html file within our public folder, and this is the core HTML page. This is the basic bare bones HTML structure of our page. You'll also notice when I save this file, Prettier will go to work on this HTML file as well and adjust it accordingly. But the fact remains that we have a whole bunch of information here in the head element, and that's all the stuff that pulls in, for example, the favicon and sets the device width. But the core heart of the content that the user sees, which is within the body tag, is basically just a single div with an ID of app. And there's nothing within this div, so by default, this HTML isn't really rendering anything significant to the screen. So how are we able to see the Vue app that we just saw in our browser? So that happens in the source directory and the main.js file. So I'm going to open this file side by side with index.html. And there is a whole bunch of JavaScript code in here, and what I'm actually going to do is delete it, and we're actually going to write back that code from scratch, and the reason we're going to do that is just so we can talk a little bit more about what it's doing. This is some sample code that the CLI generated for us, but I want to make sure we don't simply gloss over it and assume that it works. I want to talk more about what exactly is going on, and in order to do that, we're going to write that same code from scratch. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to create a Vue application right here, and then we're going to try to connect it so that it renders or mounts, in other words, right here where this div is. So we want to have this Vue application, which is basically just a complex JavaScript configuration, and we want to kind of plug it into this section right here. The first thing I'm going to do is to import a function from the Vue library called createApp, and that is a named export. So right here in my main.js file, I'm going to write import createApp from Vue. This is a named export from the Vue library. All right, and when we call createApp, we're going to need to invoke that function and provide it with a root component, which brings us to the question, what is a component? For now, the easiest way to think about a component is just a slice of your user interface. So it's a chunk of the page, right? It's some section of your web page. So if you think about a typical web app, it may have something like a navigation menu, then a main content area, and then a footer. And you could say that maybe that page consists of three distinct components: the navigation menu, the main content, and the footer. Now, there's no right or wrong answer about what a single component should be. Some developers can say, well, a button is a single component. It's a chunk of the user interface, right? So it's not some kind of technical idea that has a perfect definition. It's kind of just a unit that we use to describe some section or some chunk or some piece of the web page, right? So a Vue component is going to kind of render itself, and in that Vue component, we might have other components being rendered as well. It's actually the exact same idea as we have in HTML, right? If we think about HTML, for example, we may have something like a div, and you do not need to copy along with this, by the way. We may have a div, and in that div, we may have something like an unordered list, and in that unordered list, we may have a list item, right? And it's sort of a similar idea. This can be considered a chunk of code on our screen, and we have this sort of top-level container. Within there, we have its child elements, and within that, we have its own child elements as well. And Vue components work the exact same way. For example, we may have a component to represent a navigation menu, and then it may render a separate component within itself to represent each navigation item. It's the exact same idea that we have with structuring HTML elements. That's just the very basic introduction. We're going to go more into components in a later lesson, but the key takeaway here is that a Vue component is just a chunk of the interface. And in order to run the create app function, it needs at least some component that it's going to use as the basis to kick everything off with, right? So you can almost think of it in equivalent terms of HTML. HTML sort of begins with this top level HTML tag right here. That's sort of the parent that gives birth to all of these other children right here. It's sort of the same idea here. This function needs the root component, the starter component, almost like the grandfather component that's going to start rendering all these other smaller components underneath it that form the hierarchy of what we see on the page. So in our app, we have a Vue component. And all Vue components, by the way, will be in files with a .vue extension. So right here, we have this app.vue component in the same source directory as main.js. So what I want to do is import this component right here and pass in that component as the argument to create app. What I'm telling Vue is I want to create an app, and I want this app component to be its kind of starting basis, its foundation, its first thing to render on the screen. All right. And then ultimately later on, of course, in app is where we start rendering all of the other smaller components that each handle their own chunks of the screen and so on. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to import the app component from the app.vue file in the same directory. So I'm just going to use relative imports right here. I'm just going to say from the same directory, which is what this / is, import the app component. And it's going to be a default export, so written just like this. All right. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in that app component right here. So by itself, this will actually create a Vue app. Unfortunately, it's not connected to our HTML in any way. Now that we have this sort of Vue app with all its logic baked in, and it's rendering this app component purely in JavaScript terms, what we now need to do is we need to take that logic, that Vue component and its representation, and say, hey, plug it into right here. Where you have this div with an ID of app, take this app component and kind of inject it in there, put it there, render it there, place it there, so we see this app component rendered within here. Because remember, our HTML right now has a single empty div, which is going to show up as nothing on the screen. We want this content to show up right here. So in order to do that, the object that we get back from create app has a method called mount, and mount describes where we want to actually mount, or in other words, put the component on the screen. So if you think about mounting a picture on the wall, it's the exact same idea, except in this case, the app is our picture and our HTML file is our wall. So we have to say exactly where we want to mount this app, or equivalently this painting. So where do we want to put this app component? Right here in this div with an ID of app. The way we can target this div is by using its ID, which is also conveniently app. So the way we do that is we provide a string, and in order to target an element by its ID, we use this hashtag, so hashtag app. Okay, so just again to clarify, this can be whatever we want. So if this ID, for example, was whatever, that would be totally fine as long as we say target the HTML element with a ID of whatever, right? So as long as this matches what this is right here, we should be fine. However, the common community convention is going to be app, since that just makes sense. All right, so I'm going to switch this back to app and this to app as well. And so I know it can be a little bit confusing because we're using the word app to mean many different things. In this case, create app means our Vue application. In this case, app as the argument is our app component, which is just a chunk of user interface. And then in this case, this ID of app is simply using the element or ID selector in order to target this specific div right here, so that Vue knows that it's going to take that app component and inject it or mount it right here. And that's how these two files are connected to each other. The index.html file loads the web page and the bare bones HTML. Then it loads in the JavaScript file containing the Vue. Vue kicks everything off by launching the app component, and then it looks for where to inject itself into the HTML page. We told it to look for the element with an ID of app, so it takes the Vue app and it kind of places it in there, and from that point, the Vue app takes over and JavaScript is completely in control. The JavaScript bundle determines how to put up elements on the screen, how to tear down elements, how to replace elements, how to replace elements as we navigate from one page to another. It's a single page app because it's still fundamentally a single HTML file that never changes. Everything the user sees that updates on screen is handled entirely by the Vue and by JavaScript, all right? And this is where we kick everything off. So this is where the process begins. This is where the Vue app mounts, all right? So hopefully that has been helpful, and later on we'll talk more about what a component is in Vue terms. I'll see you in the next lesson. All right, so in this lesson, I want to show you a quick shortcut that we're going to be using throughout this project. So you'll notice in our file explorer, we have this file called Jsconfig.json. And we don't have to worry too much about this file, but you'll notice there is this section right here called paths, and there is this key that has the @ symbol in it. This is the @ symbol that you might find typically in an email address, right? And you'll notice that it corresponds to an array with the word src in it. Now, src, as you may notice, is a directory here, right here in our project, and it stands for source. So basically what this means is whenever we want to reference the src directory in our code, in, for example, a JavaScript file, we can use a shortcut of an @ sign, this @ sign right here. So if I go back to my main.js file, and I'm just going to write a comment here, you don't have to follow along. If, for example, I wanted to reference this file, hello-world.vue, inside components, inside src, what I can simply write in my import statement is @ sign followed by a slash and then components and hello world. So basically that @ sign is simply a shortcut or an alias for source, for src right here. Whenever I use this, I simply mean go find the src directory. So that's a little bit of a shortcut to allow us to write less code. It's configured automatically for us in Jsconfig by the Vue CLI when it created all of these files for us. So as a quick example right here, on line 2 in main.js, you'll notice that we're making a relative import of the app component from app.vue. That's what this / means. It means from the current directory. If instead we wanted to use that syntax, we could import directly from the top of source because that's where our app.vue file is. Notice that it's right here inside the src directory. So what I can do as an alternative import is write an @ sign right here because that means src, right? src/ followed by the actual name of the file, which is app.vue. And what I'm typically going to be doing throughout this project is relying on imports like these, absolute imports, meaning from the top of my code base rather than relative to the file that I'm in. I generally prefer this approach because I don't like imports that look like this where, we're going up 2 directories, then going up into another directory, etc. I don't like those because they tend to confuse me. I like to think of everything from the top level down. So we're going to be utilizing this @ symbol a lot. Again, it simply represents source, and from that point, you can reference any of the folders or files that you have in here. And since all of our Vue components and all of our Vue code is going to be somewhere in the source directory, that makes it super simple for our project. So go ahead and update line 2, but that is all there is to cover in this lesson, and I will see you in the next one. All right, so in this lesson, I want to talk more about Vue components and the parts that they consist of. So let's open up our app.vue component. This is within our src directory. And as a reminder, this is the component that we are mounting in our main.js file. So as a reminder, here we are importing app. And remember, we are hooking into that div with an ID of app, and we're asking Vue to mount our app component inside that div. So this is sort of the place where it all begins as far as the content that we are seeing in our browser. All right, so before we talk about what's going on in this file, I want to give you another helpful analogy for understanding a component. You may recall the jigsaw puzzles that you used to do as a kid, right? Jigsaw puzzles had a whole bunch of pieces and you connected them together to form a complete picture, right? So you can think of a component almost like a puzzle piece and as the web page as your final puzzle, right? So a component is just some kind of chunk of that web page, and it can be as large or as small as you want it to be, in the same way that you can have a jigsaw puzzle that has 2 pieces or 1,000 pieces. It doesn't really matter how many pieces you have. All that matters is that you connect these pieces together to form the greater whole. It's the same idea here. A Vue component is just some chunk of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and then you can use those components in combination with each other to form the web page, or you can have a component render its own smaller components within itself, right? So it's kind of a combination of smaller pieces to form a greater whole. So as I mentioned, each component is just going to have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And if we look inside this app.vue file, you'll notice 3 distinct sections here. We have this section that begins with this opening and closing template tag. We have this section that begins with an opening and closing script tag. And then we have this section right here that begins and ends with an opening and closing style tag, all right? So you could probably guess what each one of these sections are responsible for, but let's go through them anyway. So in this template section, we're going to write either vanilla HTML or we're going to render additional components. So what we're doing here, for example, on line 2, this is plain HTML. This is the image element from HTML. In comparison, what we're doing on line 3 is rendering another component that is called Hello World. If you open up the src components directory, you can find that Hello World component right here. And if I open up that Vue file, you'll notice that it consists of the exact same structure. It starts with a top-level template section, and in that template section, we have a whole bunch of HTML. So whenever we're rendering the Hello World component, we are rendering this puzzle piece, which in turn is going to render all of this HTML. So it's almost like a find and replace operation. Whenever Vue sees Hello World, it understands that this is its own component with its own HTML, and it substitutes that HTML into here. So why do we use components? So that we can split up these responsibilities, we can split up these chunks, split up these puzzle pieces into more lightweight, single responsibility pieces of the user interface. Instead of having one huge HTML file with 1,000 lines, we identify the elements that are kind of smaller pieces of it and then build them independently of each other, right? So in the template section, we have a combination of HTML as well as other components. In the script section, we have valid JavaScript code. That's one thing that makes a Vue file really cool, is that there's actually different languages at play here. In the template section is HTML plus additional stuff. And in the script section, this is all valid JavaScript code. So here you can see we have an import and we have the creation of an object with properties. This is valid JavaScript code. And it is in this section that we define the interactivity of the specific component. So this logic right here is always going to connect to the HTML logic in the template section. This is where we're going to enable interactivity. So to give you a very basic example, if we had a component that was rendering a button, we might render that button in the HTML side of the Vue file, the template section, but reacting to a button click, which is logic-based, JavaScript-based, we would put that logic in the script section. So this is kind of where we put all of the JavaScript code related to this component. And then finally, the style section right here is CSS styling specifically for this component. And then we're going to talk about some caveats of CSS a little bit later, but for now, the best way to think about it is here's my HTML, here's how we style it, and here is some JavaScript logic related to it as far as interactivity is concerned, right? And you're going to notice this pattern in every single Vue component file. So if I go to my Hello World component, which app is rendering, you're going to notice right here we have our template section. I'm going to scroll all the way down past this HTML. You'll notice it's going to be closed off with a closing template tag. Then we have a script section, and in here we have valid JavaScript, and then we close that section off. And then finally we have the style section, and in here we have totally valid CSS. So this is valid CSS in the same way that this is valid JavaScript, in the same way that this is valid HTML. Instead of separating them across different files, the Vue developers think it's best to put them within a single one, because a component is supposed to encapsulate all of the related aspects that make up that chunk of the UI. What its structure is in terms of the HTML, what it looks like, and how you interact with it, which is JavaScript. And again, if your component becomes too large, then the idea is that you break that up into smaller components, each one with its own styling, its own logic, its own template. So that is the beauty of components. You could technically have a Vue app with just one component, right? You could have a component with 5,000 lines in it, but that defeats the entire purpose of why we use Vue. Instead, the idea here, of course, the best strategy is to have lots of small different components that are each responsible for one small thing in your user interface. All right, that's a quick introduction to what we have as the contents of a Vue component file. Again, a Vue component will live in a .vue file. It's going to have a template section, it's going to have a script section, and it's going to have a style section. And those represent the HTML, the JavaScript, and the CSS, respectively, for that component, for that chunk or slice of the user interface. All right, more on this in the next lesson. Okay, so in this lesson, I want to show you the power of components. The primary benefit of components is reusability. By being able to pack away a chunk of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS into a separate file, we create almost like a reusable puzzle piece that we can use over and over again. In addition, we can customize that sort of piece of the user interface ever so slightly to enable a lot of reusability and flexibility. So let me give you an example. On the right-hand side here, I have our Vue app in the browser, and here I have my app component. You'll notice that our app component starts with this image tag, and that is this V logo right here. And then the rest of the content here, this whole section right here, is the content of our Hello World component. So our app component is rendering the Hello World component, which is why this content appears right here. Now, the beautiful part about components is we can reuse them as often as we'd like. So what I'm going to do here is copy line number 3 and paste it down below. So now I'm going to render 2 hello world components right after each other. And as soon as I save this, we're going to see the changes in the browser. And exactly as we'd expect, we now see a second section of this page, which is the second rendering of the hello world component right here. Right? It's the exact same component, but we're rendering it twice in a row. And thus, we don't have to worry about the complexities of this HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because it is all packaged away in its own independent hello world component. It sort of serves the exact same purpose as a function does in JavaScript. A function is almost like a reusable procedure that we can use, and we can customize ever so slightly with things like arguments, right? But the whole purpose of a function is to isolate some logic, some responsibility, and then continue reusing it so we don't have to rewrite it over and over again. That's the exact same benefit that components give us, but on a visual scale. We can now reuse this logic, this idea of a header and a paragraph and this collection of links, etc., over and over again. Of course, this is not really a practical example because we probably don't want this, but you can probably see how it would be applicable to something like a style button or a navigation menu. A component allows us to isolate just this chunk, this piece of the user interface, and use it as often as we need. And as I also mentioned, there is room for some degree of flexibility. So I know that this syntax is a little bit weird here, but you'll notice we have this string here, welcome to your VueJS app. And as you might guess, this is the actual string that is becoming the header that we see right here and right here. And so for our second rendering of our second hello world component, we can alter this to something else like, I'm happy to be learning Vue. And as soon as I save this, you'll notice that the second component right here will re-render, and that string, and we'll talk more about the syntax later, but this string is obviously becoming the header right here. So we're sort of able to keep the logic of keeping the component just about the exact same way or in the exact same puzzle piece as the one above, but we're customizing one little detail of it, which is the header. All right, and that's the power of components. We can still add flexibility to each one while retaining that commonality and reusability. All right, a couple more things to talk about when we are discussing components. You'll notice this syntax right here, and I just want us to take a second to pause and reflect on it. This is one way that we can render a component. The way we render a component is going to be the exact same way that we render an HTML element. We're going to start with that opening bracket, the less than sign. Then we're going to write the component name. Then we're going to provide any potential arguments. We'll go more about what this exact thing here is, MSG, later, but these are almost like arguments to the component. And then we close the component with a / and then the closing bracket. And this is what's called a self-closing component tag. That basically means we're able to render a component with just a single tag. And there are things in HTML that work the exact same way. For example, such as this image tag right here. HTML has the same syntax for some elements where you have an opening tag and a self-closing tag right here. I do want to note that there is an alternative way to render a component, and it is with an opening and a closing tag. So the way you do that is exactly the same way it works in HTML. For the opening tag that begins, you simply write the opening bracket and the closing bracket without the slash, so it would look like this. And if you do this, you have to provide the complementary closing tag, and what that looks like is simply going to be another pair of brackets, and in that pair of brackets you put your / and then the name of the component. So what we have here on line 4, and let me just expand it so you can see, what we have on line 4 is the exact same thing as we have on line 3. It's just two different syntactical options. This is rendering the hello world component with a self-closing tag. This is rendering the hello world component, but starting it off right here with the kind of beginning tag and closing it right here with the closing tag. Now, obviously, the next question you have is when might we want to use each one? Well, obviously, if it works by itself with a self-closing tag, you should prefer the self-closing tag because it's lighter and leaner and requires less code, right? But there are certain situations where we can put things inside the opening and closing component tags the exact same way we can in HTML, and that will have significance to what is rendered onto the screen. We're going to talk more about those scenarios later in the course, but just realize that there are two syntactical ways to render a component. What we have on line 3 is option number 1, and what we have right now on lines 4 through 6 is option number 2, and we'll talk more about when we use this case later in the course. Just realize technically that is a possibility. All right, so with that, we can remove our second rendered hello world component, bring everything back to its starting state, and that's all there is to cover in this lesson. So I will see you in the next one. All right, so in this lesson, we're going to install a special plugin or extension for Chrome called Vue DevTools. And Vue DevTools are going to be super helpful for helping us debug or understand our Vue application. So open up Chrome and go to any site like Google, and we're going to search for this, Vue DevTools. And the very first result here is the one we want. It's going to be on the Chrome Web Store. So this is the official VueJS DevTools for the Chrome web browser. You can see it has more than 1 million users. And we're going to click, of course, the Add to Chrome button, and that is going to install it. It's going to give us this confirmation prompt, and we can click Add Extension, and that should automatically add the extension. You can see it added right here. It's going to be this V right here. In fact, let me go into here and pin it to my collection of extensions. It's going to be this V right here, and you can see right now it's pretty grayed out. And you're going to see this V light up in green whenever we are on a valid Vue app. It's going to recognize that we have a valid Vue app. It's going to kind of hook into that and then offer us a way to analyze that app. So what I'm going to do is close out of this window and go back to my actual VueJS app. And just to be safe, what I'm going to do is do a full page refresh. And in case that doesn't work, what I recommend you do is relaunch your Chrome browser entirely. But once you do this, what we want to do is go to the inspector panel, the same panel where we can, for example, see our HTML elements. So one really easy way to get there is by clicking this collection of 3 dots right here, then more tools, and then developer tools. All right, so hopefully we are familiar with this section. And what you'll notice is on this panel of tabs, you should see a new tab called View, and that is what the Vue DevTools have added for us. So notice as I click this, that's going to launch the Vue DevTools, and right here, the V is also going to be lit up in green. So we can say, we can see here the documentation, welcome to the Vue DevTools. We can have a little tour. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to click next. It's going to show you here the different various buttons. We can not just see our components here, but we can also see things like the timeline, which is basically the sequence of events as your app starts up, which component is rendered first, what it renders, a user clicks, user events, things like that. Basically the kind of timeline of things that occur in your app as it launches and as it is being used by the user. Continuing on, you can see the inspector. This is going to be our favorite section throughout the course, and we're going to explore the inspector in just a second, but this is basically going to be the tree-like structure of components that are being rendered in your app. And if I click on, we can see some more additional settings. I'm going to click next here. You can explore this all in your free time, but just realize this is basically a good sign that everything has been installed correctly. So I'm going to click skip right here. And that brings us to the Vue DevTools. And so what I want you to do here is make sure you have components selected right here. And you'll notice right here that we have a basic component hierarchy. So remember, our app kicks everything off with the app component. That is what we are rendering in main.js. This is the component that is hooking into that div with an ID of app. And so remember, this is where the app launches, and then our app component is itself rendering what we call a child component, a component within itself. And our app component is rendering the hello world component. And that's what we see here. And you can see it almost operates like a folder structure on your computer in that you can expand the top level component to see everything that it renders as a child component. And this relationship is going to proceed all the way down. So if the hello world component rendered its own 2 child components, we could then expand or collapse hello world to see its resulting components as well. And in addition, a lot of helpful features related to each component are going to appear right here on the right-hand side. Right now, we don't know what props is, and you're later on going to see a lot more different options appear here on the right. But the key takeaway is once we select any component, we're sort of going to see its configuration on the right-hand side, and we're going to be able to alter that configuration in line here in this extension, and then of course see the immediate changes in our Vue app on screen. So the Vue DevTools are going to be a super helpful tool for debugging and understanding our Vue app as we navigate through the course. So make sure you install this helpful extension, and I will see you in the next lesson. Okay, so congratulations on reaching the end of another course section. What we're going to be doing at the end of each section is doing a quick review lesson like this one, just a quick slide deck where we summarize everything that we've learned. As always, these lessons are optional, so if you feel that you have a good grasp of the concepts that we've talked about, feel free to skip ahead. Otherwise, stay here for a quick recap. So first up, we learned about the Vue CLI, or the Vue command line interface, and it's basically a tool or a piece of software that we run from our command line that helps us to create, manage, and update Vue projects. We used the Vue CLI to create our job search project. And then the first thing we explored is this feature of hot reloading, which is available out of the box. Hot reloading basically means that Vue and Vue CLI will re-render the Vue application in our web browser whenever we make a change in the code. And that offers us a really good chance to get a quick feedback loop to see the results of our code changes immediately. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the technologies that we'll be utilizing. I know we haven't learned too much about many of them yet, but I promise we're going to go really into detail into a lot of these things, such as Jest, which is our testing library. And we also, of course, have Eslint, which is our linter, which is looking for violations or errors in our code. And then Prettier, which is our formatter, and that just deals with how the code looks. So our core HTML file, which we have in the public folder, is pretty bare bones. It just consists of a single div with an ID. In our scenario, it was the ID of app. And that's kind of the way that a single page application works. And that is true whether it is Vue or React or Angular. We basically load a very simple HTML page, then we get a big JavaScript file, and then that respective library or framework takes care of rendering everything else on the screen. So the library, in this case Vue, is going to render a button, then tear it down. It's going to render a list, then tear it down, etc., including as the user eventually navigates from screen to screen. So we create our Vue app by mounting, and mounting simply means to put up. We mount a root component inside the div. What is a root component? It's basically any Vue component that we want. We basically have to just establish a starting point, and Vue is going to say, okay, you've given me this starter component, almost like the grandparent of the entire component hierarchy, and Vue finds that div on the page with the ID of app, and it just plugs in your component code into that location, right? And then moving forward, Vue takes care of all future DOM updates. And that just basically means Vue takes care of all the changes that you see visually on your screen. All right. Each Vue component is stored in a .vue file, and generally the best practice is one component per file. And each Vue component file includes primarily 3 sections. I think only 2 of them are required, which is template and script, but there are 3 sections that can occur in a Vue component file. The first is the template section for HTML. The second is a script section for JavaScript code related to that HTML. And then finally, that optional style section, which is CSS related to the HTML. So once again, the idea is that we have this encapsulated chunk of user interface, and we have all of the HTML, the CSS, and JavaScript that is required just to make that piece of the UI functional. All right. And as far as the order of those 3 elements, template, script, and style, that order is not technically required. You can technically have them in whatever order you want, but it is common convention to follow this order we see right here: template, then script, then style. All right, so what's the benefit of components instead of writing everything within a large HTML file? Well, components enable reusability. We can isolate a piece of the user interface into its own component. We saw that a lesson or 2 ago where we rendered the hello world component multiple times and adjusted one small string to see how it altered the component. So there was some degree of flexibility in customization, but we still retain the benefits of reusability. So we can write a piece of code once and then reuse it over and over again. It works the exact same way that a function works in JavaScript. A function captures some degree of business logic, and then we can rerun or reinvoke that function over and over again. It's the exact same idea here, except components solve that problem for the user interface, for the view that the user goes through in the browser. There's many different websites where you're going to see a pattern where the sections of the page have these reusable sections, right? So for example, if you're on an e-commerce site like Amazon and you're searching for a product, you're going to see a whole bunch of product listings. And each one of those can be considered a re-rendered reusable component, right? Because it follows the same kind of puzzle piece. It's the same chunk of the user interface, and you can reuse it over and over again. That doesn't mean that you have to always have more than one rendering of a component. You can still render just one of a component, such as a main navigation component. But the key takeaway is that we use them as sort of a way to structure and organize chunks of isolated code to ensure that our code doesn't get too large, that we isolate responsibilities, we identify the pieces and chunks of the interface and break them up across multiple files, across multiple components, all right? And finally, we installed the Vue DevTools, and that, of course, is a Chrome extension that displays the component hierarchy and provides debugging support. And we're going to learn more about the features and functionalities of that extension as we continue building our job search app. All right, so we've covered a lot in this section, and there's been a lot of housekeeping and boilerplate. I probably probably will tell you that this is probably the most boring section of the course, and that's good news because moving forward, we're going to start to build a lot of new features and learn about the actual deep details of how Vue works. Starting in the next section, we're going to be talking about CSS in Vue. All right, so lots of fun stuff up ahead. We're just getting started. This is the exposition of the movie, and we're going to go full steam into all the exciting stuff very shortly. All right, so I will see you in the next section. All right, so welcome to the next section of the course. In this section, we'll introduce some caveats regarding how Vue and CSS work together. So here I have my app.vue file, and I want to begin by adding an h1 above our rendered hello world component. So right here, I'm going to add an h1, and I'm going to give it some sample text like, hello, I am in app.vue. And I'm going to save this, and of course, we're going to see those changes on the right-hand side. Here is the h1. And so as I mentioned in the previous section, we have this style section in every component. And of course, the ideal is that we're going to use this section to provide CSS styles for the content in our template section. So you might think to yourself, I want to style my h1 tag. Let's say we want to make this text right here purple. So what I'm going to do is go to my style section, and I'm going to add my element or tag selector. So we're going to target an h1, and this is all valid CSS. And right here, I'm going to say that I want its color to be purple. All right, and when I save this file, we're going to see indeed that the color of hello, I am in app.vue is indeed going to be purple, but we're also going to see some unintended consequences. So let's save this file and see what happens. All right, so on the right-hand side, we see indeed that our h1 is now in purple, but we have a little bit of a problem. This hello world text has also become purple. So what is going on here? Well, remember, in our app component, we are rendering our hello world component, and if I open up that file, so I'm going to open up the file using my File Explorer, which you can access with Command P on a Mac or Control P on a Windows. And so here I'm going to look for my hello world file. In our hello world file, I'm going to scroll to the template section, and right here at the very top, lo and behold, we are indeed rendering an h1. So what is happening here? Well, the styles from our app.vue component right here are escaping from the confines of this component and affecting the h1 in a totally separate component. All right, and that, of course, is a problem because it becomes pretty hard to determine where a given style is coming from, right? And this is not really ideal, right? Though the whole purpose of Vue is that each component is its own isolated, independent chunk of logic with its own styling. If we write an h1 here and all of a sudden we accidentally affect 3 other h1s across 3 other components, and we don't know where those style changes came from, that's obviously very problematic and very confusing. So by default, whenever we declare styles in our components, even in the style section, by default, they are going to be global. What it means to be global is they're going to apply to everything. If we have an h1 here, even though the style is in this style section of this component app.vue, this style and this CSS selector logic will apply to every h1 in the app. All right, and that is, of course, a problem. We're going to talk about how to solve that problem in the very next lesson. But for now, I also want to show you an alternative solution that some people might be tempted to pursue, but that will also create its own share of potential problems. So, of course, one very common way to solve a problem like this is by using more specific selectors. So somebody might say something like this. In the app component, they're going to say, okay, I can give my h1 a class, and I'll give it a sample class like header. And then down below here, since this is valid CSS, I can target that element not by its tag, not by an h1, but by the header class, right? And so if I save that, now you're going to see that indeed we get the desired result. We have hello, I am in app.vue, which is the h1 from our app file. That one is colored in purple, while the h1 in the hello world component is not affected. However, the problem here is that these styles are still global. These styles are still applying to every single component in the app. So it's not an unreasonable situation to imagine where somebody might be editing the hello world file someday and they might be saying, okay, I want to style this h1 and maybe an appropriate class to give it is something like header. And they're going to be completely shocked when they add a class like header here and don't provide any additional styles at all. And then when they save the file, Lo and behold, hello world is now in purple. And of course, the reason is because this header class and its styles are coming from this declaration right here in a totally separate file, right? And this can be very confusing if you have 100 different components in your code base. So yes, CSS class selectors or even ID selectors are a little bit more specific and offer some degree of protection, but they're not perfect because they still don't solve the fundamental problem that all of these styles are going to be available in every component. And thus, if we use the same named class anywhere else, we have a chance that it will inherit the styles from the CSS declaration in a totally different file. All right, so that is the problem we are seeing now. We're going to see how to solve this problem in the very next lesson. Okay, so let's see how we can fix the problems that we identified with global CSS from the previous lesson. So here I have my hello world.view component, that is this chunk of the page right here. And in this file, I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom where we have the style section, and you're going to notice a special keyword, and it is going to be scoped right here. So this is actually the magical keyword that's going to do the trick. As you can see in the comment right here, it says, add the scoped attribute to limit CSS to this component only. So what we can do in a Vue file is add the scoped keyword immediately after our opening style tag. Now what this does is it takes all of the CSS declarations in here. It doesn't matter whether they are element tags or class selectors or ID selectors, any CSS in here, and it's going to limit the scope or the boundaries to which these styles are applied to only this component, to only this file. So what this basically means is this H3 will now only apply these styles to H3s in hello world.view, not to any other component file. Similarly, the styles for these lists and list items and anchor tags, these styles are only going to be applied to UL, LI, and A elements in the template section in this component. They are not going to leak out, all right? So let's try this approach in app, but I also want to make an important point here because you might be curious, if we have the scoped keyword right here, why are we still seeing the purple styles from the app component filter in and affect this thing right here? As a reminder, we have a hello world here, and that is being rendered in this H1 right here with a class of header, and that header class is coming from our app.vue file. Well, remember, just because we have scope styles in here does not mean that another component styles can't pollute or come into this component. So what I mean by that is these hello world styles are scoped to this file. These declarations cannot escape to another file. However, another component styles can still make their way into the hello world file. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. This purple styling is not coming from anything here. It's coming from this declaration in another file where we have not scoped the contents, and thus these declarations are escaping across the code base and affecting the hello world component. All right, so to restate, the scoped keyword is going to limit the styles from escaping the current component that you are in. It's not going to prevent other components and their styles from polluting the current component. So in our app file, let's return this back to a basic H1 right here, an H1, and right here we're going to change this to an H1 as well, and save this, and everything is going to stay the exact same way because, again, this style of applying the purple color is still affecting every H1 in the app because it has not been scoped to this component. It has not been limited or bound to just this template. So we are going to add the scoped keyword right here. And when we save this, just a quick heads up, there's going to be a lot of changes on the page. And for now, I just want you to focus your eyes on the H1, and then we'll talk about all the other changes after that. So here I go, I'm going to save it right now. And wow, that's a pretty big change compared to the page we saw previously. Notice that we have accomplished what we originally wanted to do. Now only this H1 is going to have the purple style because this is the H1 that is in the template section of the app component. So we have scoped this style of H1 to apply only to elements and tags within the app component. So because we have limited the boundaries, Vue only applies the style to this H1 right here. It can no longer apply the style to the H1 in Hello World because these styles are now scoped. They are prohibited from escaping this component and polluting styles elsewhere. So then you might be curious, why did we lose all of the pretty formatting that we had throughout the app? Well, think about this declaration right here. This is a bunch of CSS styles targeting an element with an ID of app. And if you scroll up, you'll notice there is no actual element here with an ID of app. So what was this applying to? Well, you may recall that in our index.html file, that's where we bootstrap the entire Vue application, we have this div right here, and this is the actual div with an ID of app. So before, when we did not have the scoped keyword, these styles were allowed to be global. So Vue was able to find this div right here in our index.html file and apply these styles right here because they were valid, because they matched the ID selector of app. As soon as we added scoped, we created a boundary to prohibit these styles from escaping, and thus these styles could no longer affect anything throughout the app anywhere that has an ID of app, and that includes our index.html file. And that's why we lost all our styles, because we're no longer applying all this logic to all the content right here. Right? So as you might guess, scoped is generally considered best practice because it honors the intent of what a component is supposed to do. It's supposed to be isolated, independent. You don't want to edit one component's styles and have it reverberate and cascade into 10 other components, and then you're going to be completely confused about where a given style is coming from. Rather, you want each component to be isolated, independent, reusable puzzle piece that takes care of all of its own needs by itself. So throughout the course, we're basically going to be applying scoped just about everywhere whenever we declare CSS styles here in the style section. All right. So that's really the key takeaway from this lesson. Make sure to memorize this keyword and make sure to remember to add it after your opening style tag right here to limit the CSS styles and scope them to only the component that those styles are declared within. All right, that's all there's to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one. All right, so now that we have completed our discussion on CSS scoping in Vue, we need to do a little bit of housekeeping to prepare us for the next section of the course. Mostly, this is going to consist of deleting a lot of the files that the Vue CLI generated for us that we do not need for our project. So I'm just going to open up my file explorer right here in VS Code, and we're just going to start deleting files. So first up, in the assets folder, you'll find a logo.png file. That's just the Vue logo right here. We're not going to need it for our project right now, so we can go ahead and remove it. We can also go ahead and remove our hello-world.vue file inside the components folder. And by the way, it's failing to compile on the right-hand side because one of our components is referencing that former logo. That's totally fine. It's not building because it can't find the file it needs. Not a problem. So let's go ahead and delete our hello-world.vue component. We're gonna come back to app.vue in just a second, but I'd also like to head into the tests folder, into the unit folder, and you're gonna find this example.spec.js file. This is an example of a test file. We do not need it right now, and later on we'll create a new test file, and I'll talk you through the syntax of tests at a separate moment in time later. So we can go ahead and remove that. And then let's come back to our app file, and we're gonna clean it up a little bit. So first up, we no longer have a Hello World component, so I'm going to get rid of it right here. We no longer have our image that references that Vue logo, whose file we just deleted, so we can remove this. So we can just go ahead and leave a basic H1 because we do need some kind of content within our template tags or Vue will complain. So I'm just going to do a basic H1, but you can leave whatever you want. And I'm just going to leave a text here of Hello Vue. Right here in our script section, this is where we were formerly importing the Hello World component from a separate file. We'll talk more about components and imports at a separate point later, but the short story here is we no longer have this component, so we no longer need to import it. And right here in our components key, we can delete that key entirely. So all we're left here in this script section of the course is just going to be an object with a name property set to app. All right. And then finally, we actually do not need a style tag unless we are adding CSS styles. And we no longer have any CSS styles to add to this component. It's just a plain H1. So we can remove all of this content down below, the style tag. And once we save this, the Vue app should be able to render properly because now all the files are present. And we should be left with this super simple Hello Vue H1 tag in our app. Right? And that's all we need. We're starting from scratch. We're going to truly build this job search app from the very beginning, from the very first component, and we're going to start tackling that in the very next section. We're also going to talk a little bit about a cool CSS framework called Tailwind. That's what's next on our docket. So lots of fun stuff lies ahead. I will see you in the next lesson. All right, so let's do a quick section review. We'll typically do these at the conclusion of every section just to summarize our learnings from the previous lessons. And this one was a pretty short section. So of course, we know that we can write our CSS styles inside a Vue component's style tags. And inside those style tags, we can write any kind of valid CSS that we want. We can target IDs, classes, HTML elements, etc., whatever you'd like. It's just plain CSS. But of course, the most important takeaway from these lessons is that we want to add the scoped keyword right after style. And what scope does is it limits the CSS styles to just the current component. So if we target, for example, a CSS class, it's only going to apply the styles to that class in that component. If that CSS class is written in another component, the styles will not be applied. So the scoped keyword prevents CSS leakage, it prevents pollution across different files, it makes it easier to define components as they should be defined, as small, isolated, reusable, independent pieces of our UI. All right, that's all there is to cover here. I'll see you in the next lesson. Welcome to the next section of the course. In this section, we're going to install the Tailwind CSS utility library or CSS framework. And we're going to be using Tailwind to help us write really quick, easy CSS styles throughout the course. Now, you may be thinking, but hey, this is a Vue course. I don't want to learn about all this extra stuff. But remember, at the end of the day, we're building a real-world front-end application. So we are going to need to style it so that it looks like the inspiration from which it's coming, the Google Careers website. So we are going to need to write CSS styles at some point throughout the course. We're not going to obsess over it, but I think Tailwind is a really, really efficient, popular, modern way to do it, to write our CSS styles, and it's going to be super simple. This was actually my very first project practicing and using Tailwind CSS, and I found it to be an absolute joy to use. And it's also another modern technology that you can add to your resume alongside Vue. So here we are on Tailwind's official website, and I want to talk to you quickly about what this library is and what it adds. So whenever you hear the words CSS library or CSS framework, you might think of Bootstrap. So Bootstrap, if you haven't heard of it, is a library that basically gives you pre-configured what I call component styles. So for example, if you want to add Bootstrap to your app, you might get a CSS class called button. And when you apply that button style to a button in your app, it will apply a whole bunch of aesthetics to that button. For example, it might give it a blue background, black text, it might give it rounded corners and a certain box shadow, etc. So the idea is that you don't have to build these pretty looking buttons out of the box. Bootstrap gives you a class to apply those CSS styles automatically. So Bootstrap is focused on kind of the user-facing components that an app might need, like a button, or like a nav bar, or like an alert, or an icon, or a card, things that are actually part of the UI. Tailwind is not exactly the same thing. It doesn't give you these pre-built aesthetic styles out of the box. Rather, what it gives you is CSS utility classes. So imagine that we just have a library that gives us hundreds of different CSS classes that we can apply as often as we want throughout our app. And all of these classes are super small and compact, and they typically do just one thing. So the idea behind Tailwind is that you apply a bunch of classes together, each one of them takes care of one thing, and then when they're all combined together, you have the styles you need. But you never actually have to worry about naming your own CSS classes, gathering styles together, etc. We're going to see an example of how this all plays out in our app shortly, but I just want to give you a quick example here on this web page. You can see it says here, Tailwind is a utility-first CSS framework packed with classes like Flex, PT4, Text Center, and Rotate 90. So immediately we can tell from these names, this isn't things like button or form or card. Rather, these are classes that apply direct CSS styles to whatever elements we add them to. So for example, the Flex utility class from the Tailwind CSS library will apply display flex. So it's a really easy way to add a flex box to a component. If you have a div and you just want to make it a flex box, you do class equals flex, and Tailwind gives you that availability, so now you have a flex box. You no longer have to come up with a semantic name for that box, like you don't need to do header or center container or wrapper. All you need to know is I have this class called flex that's coming to me from the Tailwind library. I apply it to a div, and now I have a flex box, right? A similar idea here with PT4. PT actually stands for padding top. You don't have to memorize all of these little nicknames. We'll talk more about them later. But the idea is, hey, if you have an element and you want to add padding to the top of it, you can do PT followed by some kind of number. So starting with PT1, that's the smallest amount of padding, then PT2, PT3, PT4, that adds padding to the top of whatever element you want. Similarly, you can apply the CSS utility class text center that TailwindCSS is going to give us, and that's going to center align the text in an element. So you can see here as I scroll down, when we write our code, it's going to be primarily writing a whole bunch of extra classes inside our HTML. So the advantage of this is that we don't need to write a lot of custom CSS classes. We don't have to worry about things like nesting or Sass or any of those kind of complexities of CSS that make it difficult to keep scope limited. We talked a little bit about scope in the previous section when we talked about the scoped attribute in Vue. And this is a similar idea. The idea is the Tailwind CSS library is going to give us pretty much all the utility classes we need to style our elements in a way that's going to look like the Google Careers page. It's going to look just like this. We're going to have a div, and we're just going to apply a whole bunch of helper classes to it that are going to add different styles to it. And that's going to immediately format the page in a way that we want. Now, the best way to experience Tailwind, of course, is to see it in action. I certainly don't believe that I've made the case so far as to why this is a great framework. I personally love it, but I think as we continue writing CSS throughout the class, you're going to see how it helps us really quickly just get CSS up and running so that we don't have to worry about it and don't have to worry about cascading conflicts and all of those other things, and can focus primarily on the Vue concepts. All right. So this is a quick introduction to Tailwind. In the very next lesson, we're going to set it up in our Vue project. Okay, so in the previous lesson, we explored the benefits of Tailwind CSS, and in this lesson, we're going to use the Vue CLI to add it to our project. As you'll see, it's going to be a super simple setup process. So the first thing I want you to do is to open up your command line or your terminal and navigate to your job search directory where we have our project. And I recommend shutting down the running server if there is one. And when I say running server, I mean if you still have the output from Npm Run Serve, where we are actually transpiling the Vue app and showing it in our browser, I want you to shut that process down. Typically on a Mac, that's going to be something like Command D or Command C. And on a Windows machine, I imagine it would be something like Control D or Control C. And in case that doesn't work, you can always just close your terminal application and relaunch it, and that should do the trick. Regardless, here is where we want to be. I am in the job search directory and nothing is running. And we're once again going to use our Vue CLI program. And the command we want here is going to be add. And as you might guess, this is going to add a dependency to our project. And the beautiful part about the Vue CLI in comparison to just a plain npm install is this will not only download and fetch the dependency, but also create some basic setup files, some basic boilerplate code to get started. So that is the advantage of Vue CLI. It is specifically designed to add a technology to a Vue project. And so it's not going to have support for every package, but in this case, it does have support for Tailwind. So what we want to add here is Vue add Tailwind. So go ahead and press enter here, and that's going to start the process of installing the plugin, fetching the dependencies. It's also going to give us this option right here. Tailwind is going to have a configuration file in our code base called tailwind.config.js. We'll take a look at that at the end of this lesson, and this is offering us an option as far as the starter configuration that we want. So we can keep this option of minimal, so just press enter again. And that, of course, is actually going to start the process of downloading the actual Tailwind NPM package, as well as creating all of the files. So as always, this might take a couple seconds to run, but it's going to complete right here. And with that, we can jump into VS Code and see all the files that it has generated for us. All right, so the first thing we're going to see is in our source directory in assets, we have a new tailwind.css file. And as I open this file, you're going to see a slightly unconventional syntax. It's just going to be @tailwind base, components, and utilities. We'll never have to worry about this file again, but basically what this is doing is using a special syntax to import all of Tailwind's available CSS classes. So basically what we're doing here is all of those hundreds, if not thousands, of utility classes that we saw in the previous lesson, the classes that deal with margin and padding and font size and all that stuff, this is basically loading them all in, and they're going to be available to use automatically simply with this code right here. All right, then the other file that's been affected here is main.js, and if I open that file here, You can see here in this file where we are bootstrapping the Vue application. As a reminder, here is where we are loading our starter app component and connecting it to that div with an ID of app. Here you can see on line 3, we are importing our new Tailwind.css class, and simply by doing that, we are registering all of those CSS utility classes to be available to be used in our codebase. Notice here that we are using a relative import. We can once again be consistent and use the @ symbol. So remember, the assets directory is directly in the source directory, which we can represent with the @ sign. So right here, I can do the @ sign followed by the remaining code, and that is going to be the exact same file reference. All right, so that takes care of importing the styles. And then of course, this post CSS config.js file, we will never have to worry about it again, but it's another kind of configuration file related to post CSS, which as I understand it is its own other separate CSS translation pipeline. Basically, we're not going to need to touch this file ever again, so don't worry about it. The file that we will be concerned with throughout the course is going to be this one right here, tailwind.config.js. And here is where we're going to be able to extend and manipulate how Tailwind works. So Tailwind gives us a lot of CSS classes out of the box, but it doesn't give us everything we need. And here's where we can, for example, add custom colors, custom fonts, things like that. And you're going to see it's actually going to be incredible because Tailwind is going to take the configuration settings that we give it, and it's going to generate automatic new CSS classes for us out of the box. And that's one of the most incredible features that I was totally impressed by when I was building this course out, was seeing how Tailwind just took the configuration I gave it and then created these helper classes on top of all the ones that it ships with. So it makes it super simple to just add a whole bunch of CSS classes in line to an element and then see the impact immediately with minimal effort. All right, so we're going to explore this file in greater depth throughout the course, but that's all there is to cover in this lesson, and I will see you in the next one. All right, so the first thing that I want to do in this lesson is to create a new file inside our source directory, and I'm going to call it playground.js. So the purpose of playground.js throughout this course will be to be a playground where we can test out different JavaScript and Vue concepts outside the scope of our actual job search project. So as we introduce certain concepts that I think would benefit from some additional explanation or examples, we're going to write out those examples within playground.js. Most of these lessons that are going to use the playground.js file are pretty optional because they're going to depend on whether you know the concept or not. So for example, in this case, in this lesson, we're going to talk about the ES6 spread syntax for arrays. That's the ... that you place before an array in your program. And we're going to utilize this ES6 concept in the very next lesson. So if you're unfamiliar with it, stick around. If you are familiar with it, if you've seen this before, you can feel free to skip this lesson. All right, but we're going to write out our actual practice code within playground.js. So let me hide my file explorer and let's write some code. Okay, so let's declare two arrays. One is going to be an array of fruits and one is going to be an array of vegetables. So right here, I'll do const fruits and I'll do a 3-element array of strings. Let's do apple, let's do banana, and let's do orange. And on the line below, I'll declare a similar array of vegetables. And we can put just 2 strings in here. Let's do cucumber and let's do radish. You'll notice the little orange squiggly lines at the very end. That's actually Prettier complaining that we don't have semicolons. Not a problem. If we save our JS file, you can see that we format on save and automatically Prettier will add those beautiful styles for us. We still have these red squigglies, but of course that's coming from the fact that we are not using our fruits and vegetables arrays. Okay, so here is our challenge. What I want to do is to merge together the strings within my 2 arrays. So in other words, I want a new array that's going to consist of 5 elements: apple, banana, orange, cucumber, and radish. How can I merge or combine these 2 arrays together? Well, here's what a beginner might think, which is a solution that actually will not work. And by the way, in order to output any text, which we're going to need to do when we run this program with Node from our terminal on the right-hand side, we can use console.log, just like we do in our browser. So for example, I'm going to put a console.log here, and I might think to myself, well, I know I need a new array, so can I just put fruits in here, and can I just put vegetables in here? And will that accomplish what we want? And the answer is no. So let's take a look at what this gives us. So on the right-hand side, I'm going to use node to run my file, and my file is within the src directory, and it's called playground.js. So right here, node source, playground.js, and when I run this, you're going to see, I'm going to expand this so it's a little bit easier to see, that we actually do not get an array of 5 elements, we get an array of 2 arrays, right? We've kept the original boundary, the original array of fruits and vegetables inside right here and right here, inside this new array that we have generated right here. And that's not what we want. We want to extract those original elements and store them in a new array. So in order to accomplish that, we need to use a special syntax, and it's the ... syntax. So I'm going to put it right here before fruits and then talk a little bit about what it does. What this effectively does is it extracts all of the elements of fruits in line here. So imagine literally just copying these elements right here and putting them inside right here where we have ... fruits. We are not making an exact copy of the array because we are not keeping the outer array itself. We're just taking the internal elements, in this case, the internal strings from the fruits array, and then we're basically spreading them out in this position, in this spot, inside this new array that we've declared with this opening and closing square bracket. So now we're going to spread out the values from our original fruits array in our new array. So let's explore the differences right here. I'm going to rerun the file, and you can see the difference between these two syntaxes side by side. I've spread out the fruits array so its elements appear as they should in my new generated array, but I have not spread out the vegetables array, so I have the complete original array inside this array that's being output. So of course, to complete this assignment, to get all of the elements merged in together, I need to apply the same spread syntax to my vegetables array as well. So right here, again, to practice, whenever you have an array and you have it assigned to a variable in this case, you can place a ... in front of it, and that will take, not crypto, but ... That is going to take the elements of that array and spread them out. Effectively copy them to a new destination, to a new data source, but not keeping the original array that they are in, right? So we're basically copying apple, banana, orange, and then after that, we're copying cucumber and radish, and then we're going to consolidate all of those and store them in the new array that we have right here with square brackets. So if I remove this right here and we run this file, now we've accomplished our original goal. We have merged together the elements of the fruits and vegetables arrays into a new array. So that's what you use the spread syntax for, primarily used to copy elements from other arrays into new arrays while getting rid of the original array structure. All right. And fruits and vegetables, by the way, have not been modified or mutated in any way throughout the process. We still have access to them and they remain the same original arrays. This is a brand new array that we have generated just for this line. Fruits and vegetables remain as they are. All right. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. So I will see you in the next one. All right, so the next step on our journey is to add a font to our project. The goal here is to have a very similar look and feel to the actual Google Careers website. Now, as it turns out, the Google Careers website uses a font called Google Sans, which is proprietary. That means that it's owned and copyrighted, and we can't actually use it outright unless we ask for permission or pay some kind of fee. So instead of using Google Sans, we're going to use a popular alternative, which is very similar in look and feel, called Open Sans, all right? And again, since we're not super concerned with having our CSS be 100% pixel perfect and 100% identical to the Google Careers site, this, I think, is a reasonable compromise. The focus of this course, of course, will always be the Vue aspects of it. With that said, I do want the site to actually look as close to the real thing as we can get reasonably. So we're going to be incorporating this Open Sans font into our project. So you can open up your web browser and go to fonts.google.com, and here is sort of a search engine for fonts, and Google makes it very easy to add any of the fonts here to our project. And of course, I want to search for a font right here called Open Sans. And we're going to see the results here, and we want this one by Steve Madison, Open Sans. So go ahead and click on that tile. and it's going to bring you to this page where we see a bunch of styles or variants of this font in various kind of font weights and like bold, italic, sizes, etc. So as we navigate through this page, we're going to click this select this style button to select a bunch of various variations of this Open Sans font that we're going to need. So we can start with light 300. We'll select the style, and as soon as I do that, we're going to get this pop-up appear on the right. We'll come back to that in just a second. We also want to include regular 400, so once again, select the style. We also want to include semi-bold 600, select the style, and then bold 700 as well, select the style. And what Google is going to give to us on the very right-hand side is this link text right here. We can copy everything we see in this box right here. Just copy it with Command-C or Control-C if you're on a Windows computer. And then once you have copied this blob over here, we can head back to our text editor. So I'm going to bring up VS Code. And in here, we can go to our index.html file. As a reminder, it is going to be in the public folder in your project. And if you want to open a file without going through the File Explorer, you can press Command-P on a Mac, or I believe Control-P on a Windows, to bring up the file search. And from this input, you can type whatever file name you want, find it in your project, and open it very easily. All right, that's a quick trick in VS Code. So right here, let's say right below this link right here on line 7, I'm just going to paste that content that I copied over from the Google Fonts website. You can see all it's really doing is providing just a reference to that fonts website and the Google API that provides it, and then specifying right here that we want the Open Sans font at these weights, right? Google makes it super simple to configure. Again, we don't have to really worry about what this is doing behind the scenes technically. The important user-facing feature here is that we're now enabling the use of Open Sans in our Vue project, that font. All right, and as soon as I save this file, I believe Prettier will automatically format it for us. Perfect, that works great. And there's one more thing we need to do to complete the configuration of the Open Sans font. And we're going to need to configure it to work with Tailwind. And in order to do that, I want to take you back to the web browser, and I'm going to take you to a GitHub page for Tailwind. You don't have to follow me here. Just keep your eyes peeled for what's on the screen. So basically, this is the behind-the-scenes setup or configuration for Tailwind. As I mentioned, Tailwind gives us access to a whole bunch of CSS classes and styles. It also gives us access to some default fonts, so reasonable assumptions for the font family that our HTML elements will have. So you see here in this configuration page, we have this big configuration object with a key of font family, and then here we have a sans key. Sans describes a type of font. I think it means sans means without. So sans means without curves, I believe, is the distinguishing characteristic of these fonts versus serif fonts, which do have kind of curvy edges. I'm not really super well versed on typography, but there's basically different categories of fonts, and sans is one of them, and serif and mono are other types of fonts. And sans corresponds to an array of strings, and each one of these strings represents a available font to use in our project. And the way it works is whenever our browser renders fonts, it's going to look for the very first one, and if it has that font available, it's going to use it, and if it doesn't have it, it's going to fall back to the next font, and then the next font, etc. So the reason we have a big list here is because we're accounting for all kinds of different operating systems like Windows, Mac, Linux, so at some point you're going to fall back to a reasonable font that should be available to render in your browser. So of course, what I want to do is to modify this array to include our Open Sans font. And I want to include it at the very beginning here. So our browser tries to render Open Sans font first. And now that we have it in our project, it's going to render it successfully. And then of course, if for some reason the Google font API is down and we don't have access to the Open Sans font, at that point, it's reasonable to fall back to our Tailwind default fonts, all right? So we need to configure this logic in our tailwind.config.js file to kind of inject our Open Sans font right here, all right? So I'm going to head back to my code editor, and let's open up our tailwind.config.js file. It's available at the very top level of our project, all right? And there's two things I need to do here. The first is I need to import the default theme from Tailwind. The default theme is basically a huge JavaScript configuration object. It's what we just saw in that GitHub page in the browser. It's a whole bunch of default starting values for various Tailwind values, such as the font. So at the very top of this file, I can use the old school JavaScript import syntax. I can say const equals const default theme equals, and I'm going to use the built-in node require keyword to import a file, and we're actually going to import from the Tailwind CSS library, which has now been added as a npm dependency in our project. So Tailwind CSS, and then / default theme. So that's going to import that JavaScript object and assign it to a constant called default theme. All right. So here in this big object that we have in our Tailwind config file, this is where we can customize that default theme. And as a reminder, we don't just want to replace the existing fonts from default theme. We want to add on top of them. We want to add on Open Sans before all those fonts. So right here in this extend object right here under theme, we can do a line break. And here we talk about which Tailwind properties we want to extend. And what we want to extend here is font family. So we're going to start with that key or that property. And we want to set that equal to a JavaScript configuration object, another JavaScript plain object. All right, let's do another line break here. And then, as you may recall from the GitHub page, there's actually different kinds of font families inside of Tailwind, and we want to target our sans family. All right, so in the GitHub page, we saw that this was equal to an array, right? And whatever values we put in this array right here are going to be the font families that are available for the sans category in our project. So for example, here I can put a string of open sans and make sure you spell it exactly like this, capital O, capital S with a space in between the two. And so now we've enabled our project to use the open sans font that we have just gotten from the Google Font API and made available in our index.html file. But of course, we're not done yet, because if we do this, we're going to overwrite the Tailwind default sans fonts that we just saw, that long array list of strings. So what I want to do here is use the ES6 array spread syntax that we introduced in the previous lesson to take all of my other fonts, which are represented as strings, and I want to take them from default theme, and I want to spread them out here as well, so they are available as backups if Open Sans fails to load for whatever reason. So right here, I'll put a comma, and then ... to spread an array out, and my array of fonts is going to be found at default theme, which we've imported, .font family, .sans. All right. So this again is going to be an array of strings that we just saw in our browser. We're going to spread out those values, but after our Open Sans font. So we're going to use this by default, and if it's not available, then we're going to loop through these fonts to find a backup. And when I say we, what I really mean is our browser and Tailwind and the CSS logic, all right? That's all there is to cover in this lesson. We installed our Open Sans font. We configured it to work with Tailwind. What I recommend you do now is in your terminal, if you have your Tailwind or your Vue app rather up and running, I recommend shutting it down. You can press Command D or Control D to exit, and then restart the app by running the command Npm Run Serve again. That just ensures that everything will build from scratch, and that should incorporate our newly added Tailwind library, our newly added font, our configurations, and all of those things that we've been adding over the course of the last couple lessons. So rerun npm run serve from the command line, and in the very next lesson, we're going to try out our Tailwind styles for the very first time. Okay, so we have successfully configured the Tailwind CSS utility library in our Vue application. And in this lesson, we're going to see how it helps us really easily and quickly style our elements. So on the left-hand side, I've opened up our app component, and right now it only consists of a single H1. And on the right-hand side, I have my browser, and we can see that H1 being rendered at the very top there with no styles. So the way Tailwind works is we're simply going to add a bunch of classes to each element. Remember, you can almost think of Tailwind as being this collection of hundreds, if not thousands, of CSS classes that are available to use out of the box. So now they are immediately available in this file and in any other component file that we want. We don't have to define anything down below in a style section. They're now available globally, and we can simply add them on right here. So for example, let's say I want to add some margin to the top of my H1. Well, Tailwind has a whole bunch of margin classes. They're all going to start with the letter M. M is short for margin. And then for the classes that are only going to add margin at the very top, those classes are all going to begin with MT. It's going to be MT followed by a dash, and this is still part of the CSS class name. And then what Tailwind likes to do is to have numbers. So for example, MT1 is going to be the smallest amount of top margin, then MT2, MT3, MT4, so on and so forth. So for example, I can add a class here like MT8. This is an available Tailwind class. I'm going to save this, and on the right-hand side, you can see that's going to add margin, right? And as you might guess, if I instead went with a class like MT4, that's going to be about half as much margin. There we go. And if I went with a larger class like MT12, that's going to be a little bit more margin, all right? I'm going to reduce this back down to MT8. And you might be curious, okay, that makes sense, perfect. We have all these available classes, but how do you know it's called MT, and how do you find all these available classes that you can add? Well, for that, you can head to the official Tailwind documentation. So I have that open here in a second tab. And so on this site, there's usually going to be a helpful search button or a search input. So for example, here's one on the front page, and I can simply search for something like margin and then find the page for that. For example, here's margin. And on a page like this, you're going to see all of the available CSS classes that Tailwind gives you, as well as the actual properties. This is the actual CSS code that's going to add. So if I show all classes, you can scroll down and you can see there's going to be a whole bunch of them. So as you might guess, MT is margin top, but there's also going to be MB for margin bottom, ML for margin left. And as I scroll down, there's going to be a whole bunch of them. And eventually you're going to find the ones that you're looking for. So this is how I was able to find MT8. If I just scroll down here, I was able to find MT8 somewhere here. Let me see here. Let me, in fact, do a find. There we go. So there is margin top 8, and you can see it adds a margin top of 2 rem, which, assuming a default font size of 16 pixels, is about 32 pixels of top margin, right? And of course, there's classes for margin on only the left, margin on left and right, margin on only on the right, etc. And yes, there is somewhat of a learning curve because you have to learn all these classes. But once you master one Tailwind project, the classes are going to be the same when you transition to another Tailwind project. And in addition, they're not usually that difficult to remember. They're kind of intuitive, like MT kind of makes sense, margin top. And once you memorize that, and you remember that there's a numeric component, then it's simply a matter of adjusting up or down until you get to the desired look, right? So yes, there is a learning curve, but I found that it wasn't too crazy, all right? Let me give you another example of some helper classes that Tailwind gives us. So for example, let's say I wanted to make this text a little bit larger, so font size. So there's a whole bunch of Tailwind classes that begin with the prefix text, and that's part of the CSS class name. And so usually it's going to be text dash followed by, again, some kind of qualifier or identifier. So for example, we have a text 6XL class, and that deals with font size. So when I save that, you can see we're going to get this much larger H1. If you want to reduce it, as you might guess, there's a text 4XL class, and that's going to make it a little bit smaller. Let's return this back to 6XL. And once again, how do you find these classes? You can start with the Tailwind documentation. And here, for example, is the search icon. Click on that and search for the CSS property that you're trying to find the classes for. So for example, font size, go to that page and you're going to see a whole bunch of classes dealing with that. So text XS, text SM, text LG, of course, that's short for large in the same way that SM is for small, going all the way up to text 6XL, right? And again, all of these classes are available out of the box, so you can simply add them to whatever HTML element you want as a class, and Tailwind will take care of the styling, all right? Same principle here. All right, and similarly, let's say we wanted to center this bunch of text, so alignment, right? There's another series of classes also beginning with the word text, and that's going to deal with alignment. And there's one that we're looking for here called text center, so we can save that, and that is going to center our text. All right, and that's as simple as Tailwind gets, and that's the beautiful part about it is as we navigate throughout the course, what I'm going to do when we're working with CSS is I'm just going to write class next to the element I'm trying to style, and we're just going to add on a bunch of Tailwind classes. It might be one class or it might be 10, but the idea here is we don't have to worry about other CSS problems like naming things, nesting things with things like Sass or less. All we have is a whole bunch of utility classes that can accomplish basically everything we're going to need, and so I'm just going to be able to type out a whole bunch of these classes in a row, and then we're going to get the styling we want. And that's the beautiful and super fluid and fast part of how Tailwind helps us write our styles very quickly. All right, so earlier in the course, again, we talked about having style sections in our components and then scoping them so that the styles don't escape. We really don't even have to worry about that problem at all, or even having a style section, because Tailwind is basically going to give us all the CSS utility classes we need to style our components and our styles to resemble the actual Google Careers website. All right, so that's a good way to start learning about Tailwind. In the very next lesson, I'm going to show you an extension that we can install in VS Code so we can get a lot of help with finding out these styles without having to consult the official Tailwind documentation. So I will see you in the next lesson. Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to install a super helpful VS Code extension that's going to enable IntelliSense for our Tailwind CSS classes in VS Code. What that basically means is we're going to be able to see all of the available Tailwind styles in line in our code editor, which of course makes it a lot easier because we don't always have to reference the Tailwind website. So let's go ahead and head to our extensions panel. That's going to be this collection of cubes here on the left-hand side. And the extension that I want to search for is just Tailwind. And this is going to be the very top result, Tailwind CSS IntelliSense from Tailwind Labs. You can see it has more than 1 million downloads. So go ahead and install that extension. And afterwards, I'm going to close this. And then I'm going to reopen the app.vue component from the previous lesson. So in source, components, actually at the top level of source, we're going to have app.vue. And let me show you how this is going to work. I'm going to remove my MT8 class here. And I'm just going to begin by typing something like MT. And if the extension doesn't automatically work, you can also try holding Control and pressing space, and that's going to bring up this IntelliSense. And this is actually what Tailwind CSS, the extension, gives to us. Sometimes this box will pop up automatically. Sometimes you have to trigger it using the Control key and spacebar. It's just a matter of VS Code kind of registering it. But as you can see here, the benefit here is we're going to see all of our empty classes, and even better than that, on the right-hand side in the box, we're going to see the exact CSS properties that they attach. So for example, if I move down through these empty classes, we're going to see that MT8, which is the one that we originally had, is setting a CSS property of margin top to 2rem, which with a font size of 16 pixels as a default, as you can see on the right-hand side, is equal to 32 pixels. So MT8 is going to add 32 pixels of margin on the top. Similarly, I can simply start typing a word like text and then try Control space, and we're going to see all of these available Tailwind utility classes, all right? And again, on the right-hand side, we're going to see the properties they attach. So for example, text center, which we have on the right-hand side, is going to add text align set to center. Then as I move down to all of these, we're going to see some of the available size related ones. So text XS, extra small, small, base, large, XL. And then again, we're going to see all those styles on the right-hand side. We previously had 6XL here. We can see that that adds a font size that is equal to 60 pixels. Perfect, so I can simply press enter and lock it into place. It works the exact same way that the IntelliSense works for any other language here in VS Code. All right, so I'm going to save this, and that's really all there is to cover in this lesson. Make sure you install this extension because it's going to be super helpful with identifying styles and helping you kind of have this documentation in line in your editor. All right, and with that, I will see you in the next lesson. All right, so let's wrap up this section with a quick section review. This section was focused entirely on integrating Tailwind into our project. Tailwind, of course, is a CSS framework that adds lots of utility classes, ready-made classes for us to use in our project that deal with everything from margin to padding to font size to text alignment to display, etc. Instead of having to create our own CSS classes and remember all of those CSS properties, we can just memorize a bunch of Tailwind utility classes or reference the documentation and have this very easy process of iteration where we just simply add those classes to our existing HTML elements and observe the changes in our browser until we find something that fits what we're looking for. We can use the Vue CLI to add Tailwind to a Vue project. We used the Vue add command earlier in the course, and that created a whole bunch of files for us to work with. And the primary one that we really should be concerned about is the tailwind.config.js file, and that's where we can fine-tune or set some more minute Tailwind options and settings. For example, earlier in the section, we added our Open Sans font to the project, and we made sure to tell Tailwind that it should prefer to use that font before it falls back to its array of regular fonts. All right, that's really all there is to cover in this section. Next up, we're going to talk about rendering data to our screen using Vue. Welcome to the next section of the course and to our first user story. We're going to have lots of user stories throughout the course, and my intent here, of course, is to mimic a real-world working environment. So typically how it works as a developer is that somebody, usually a product manager, will assign you a ticket of work, and that ticket of work will describe the feature that you're going to be building for the app, and usually it should incorporate the user value, the benefit of the feature that you're going to be building out as it pertains to the user. And it's very important to keep the user in mind because ultimately you're building software that's going to work for someone, and you need to quantify the value of what it is that you're building. If you're just building something for technical experimentation, it's not going to make your company any money. So it's important to describe what it is you're building and the why behind it. So let's take a look at our first user story. Imagine that we have started, it's our first day at our new careers company, and we've been assigned our first ticket. We are starting this app from scratch, and our product manager says, as a user, I'd like to navigate between the pages of the career site. There's not really a why here, but it kind of makes sense. Most websites today have a navigation menu, and users can use it to navigate between different pages of the website. We're going to have multiple pages on our career site, so it makes sense that we would have a menu to navigate from page to page. All right, so this will be the first feature that we're going to be building. It represents the very top of our app. And as we can see here, we can imagine a designer gave us a mock-up or a visual rough draft of what it should look like. Of course, we're not going to copy it exactly pixel for pixel from what we see on the screen, but we're going to aim to end up with something like this. We're going to have our company logo on the left-hand side. We'll obviously customize it so it doesn't say Google. And then we're going to have teams, locations, students, and jobs. And by building out this feature, we're going to be able to, of course, explore many introductory Vue features. All right, so we are building our navigation. That is our first user story, and I will see you in the next lesson. All right, so now that we have introduced our first user story, let's start building out our top-level navigation menu. The menu feels like an isolated chunk of responsibility. It's a distinct part of the user interface. So I propose that we place its contents inside a new Vue component. Let's create that component right now. Inside my project directory, we have our source folder where all of our code lives. And then inside there, we have our components directory. And right in here, I'm going to create a new main.nav.vue component. What I'm using here is something called Pascal case, which means I'm capitalizing the first letter of each word. So in this case, the M in main and the N in nav. So how you name your files in Vue is up to you or up to your team. The most important aspect, though, is consistency. It doesn't really matter how you name them or with what casing, as long as you maintain the same consistency for the various components in your code base. So I'm going to stick with Pascal case as we create multiple components throughout the course. All right, so here we have main nav, and now we can start writing some code inside of it. Okay, so every Vue component needs a template tag, and of course the contents of that template tag is the HTML that component will render when we use it. So right up here, I'm going to write a template HTML tag, all right, and then I'm gonna add a line break here, and we're immediately gonna get a small Eslint violation. If I hover my mouse over template, we can see it says the template requires child element. Pretty obvious. It's telling us, hey, you need to actually give me some HTML that's going to represent what a main nav means in the context of this Vue app. So for now, I'll just add an HTML5 header element, and inside there, I'll add the words main nav, just so that we can confirm there's some text on the screen when we render this component. Just in case you're unfamiliar, HTML5's header element is a new element. It's basically the exact same as a div technically, but it's a little bit more semantically accurate. The header component should be used for introductory content to the page, including things like navigational aids, like menus. So it represents a better element to use than just a div, especially for things like SEO and accessibility. All right, so here we have our header. Next up, what I want to do is add a couple TailwindCSS classes to it. Now, as far as the styles that we're going to add, I just want to give you a little bit into how my thought process here worked. All that I really did was go to the Google Careers website, open up my inspector in Chrome, and observe the CSS styles that website used. Then I took those styles, went to the Tailwind documentation, and found the corresponding CSS classes, right? So our final app is going to look pretty similar, like 95% alike to the actual real-life Google Careers app. Of course, it's not going to be pixel perfect, but close enough. So I'm no CSS wizard, I'm no design genius. All I really did was copy the existing styles into Tailwind, right? So that's where I'm going to be getting these classes from. And of course, as I introduce them, I'm going to talk you through what they're actually doing. All right, so right here, let's add 2 classes to our header. The first is going to be a Tailwind class called WFull. That stands for with full. Of course, as you can see here, it's simply going to make the header container take up 100% of its parent container in terms of width. So full width, in this case, across the screen. The next thing I want to add is a class called text small. That's going to be text-sm. We can see on the right here, it adds a font size of 0.875 rem, which is equivalent to 14 pixels. So we're just going to have a really small text here. Eventually, this is where I want to put my company name. For now, we'll stick with main nav. Okay, so this is everything we need to have a functional Vue component, but I want to add some additional metadata, some additional information for this component that will help it and help us identify it in the browser. So as we know, below our template tag, we can also add script tags. All right, so I'm going to add a script tag right here, and inside here we can write any valid JavaScript that we would like. What you're typically going to see here is you're going to see an export default statement, almost like you're exporting kind of a standard output out of a regular JavaScript file, except in this case it's going to be inside the script tag, and then you're going to export default a JavaScript object. And the way to think about this JavaScript object is a configuration object for this Vue component. All right, so just for main nav, this object is going to allow us to customize how this component works, set up a bunch of settings, provide it data, etc. We're going to talk more about the properties that we can add to this object as we progress through the course, but the central idea here is just about every Vue component is going to export default this JavaScript object, and each object will configure how that component works. So one property that we can add here is name. And hopefully this name is pretty self-explanatory. It allows us to simply give a formal name to the component because the file name is not enough for Vue. There's nowhere where we've actually said, hey Vue, this component should be called main nav. So right here, I'll provide a string called main nav. And this is going to appear in our Vue DevTools, which we'll be able to see in just a moment. All right. So you'll notice a couple more squigglies appear here. That is simply, again, Prettier complaining about the fact that it doesn't like how things look, but luckily in our project we can just save our file and we can see Prettier apply all of those additional things like extra commas and semicolons and fix it up. There's one more issue right here, and if I hover my mouse you can see Eslint wants an extra line break at the end, so I'm just going to add it and save the file, and that completes our main nav component. Okay, so at this point let's head to our browser and see if this component is successfully rendering on the page. So I'm going to flip over to Google Chrome, and we do not see our new main nav component. So what is going on here? We'll find out in the very next lesson. Okay, so why is our main nav component not rendering in the browser? Well, just because we've created a component, just because we've created this reusable chunk of the user interface, doesn't mean that Vue is going to automatically put it on the screen. After all, our app may have dozens, if not hundreds of different Vue components, and Vue doesn't know where to render each one or in what order or how many times. So we kind of have this template, but it's sitting unused in our app. So how can we get this header up onto our screen? Well, one component that we know is actually being rendered on the screen is app.vue. As a reminder, this is our launching point. This is our first component. It's an H1 that has the text Hello Vue. And if I navigate back to my browser, we can see that that's what's being displayed on the screen. As a quick reminder, the way this is happening is we have our main.js file right here. And this is the file that is mounting the Vue app into our plain HTML document. So right here, we are importing our app component from app.vue. And then this syntax right here is mounting it into the div with an ID of app. We talked about that a little bit earlier in the course. But the key takeaway here is that app is being rendered on the screen. So if we can find a way to tell the app component to render main nav, then we'll get what we want. We'll get main nav rendered to the screen. And it's going to be a two-step process to enable this. In fact, I think even more than that. But it's going to take a couple steps for us to import main nav into this file, register it with our app component, and then actually display it in the HTML. So the first step is to import the main nav component. And whenever you hear the words import, you're probably thinking JavaScript. And hopefully by now, whenever you hear the words JavaScript, your mind should immediately say, okay, that's something that's going to live in the script section, right? This is where we're going to write any JavaScript that we need for a Vue component, right? In comparison to the template tags where we have any HTML. So this is JavaScript, so we're going to put it inside our script tags, and we're going to import our main nav component. And as a reminder, we have this @ symbol available. That represents the top of our SRC, or source directory. Inside that folder, we have a components folder. And inside our components folder, we have a single component, which is main nav. And I'm just going to let it auto-complete. You'll notice that it auto-completed with the file extension .vue. That's totally fine. It's actually optional. Vue will recognize Vue components even if you exclude the extension, but I like to leave it on just to remind myself that it is a Vue component. All right, I'm going to add a semicolon here just to quiet prettier down. Okay, so we have imported main nav, but we are not yet using it. So we have to configure our app component to be able to render main nav onto the screen. All right. So whenever you hear the words configuration for any kind of Vue component, immediately you should think about the object that we're exporting here out of this file. Remember, every Vue component is going to have some bit of HTML, and it's going to have some bit of logic that we write in JavaScript. So here is our configuration object for the app component, and here I can add an additional property, and its name is pretty logical actually. Its name is going to be components. And so this is where we're going to register other components with our app component. And when I use the word register, what I mean is I'm going to enable the app component to render whatever components I put here inside this component's key. The value here is actually going to be a JavaScript object. And the way it works is like this. The property, or the key, is going to be a string and a name that represents what we want to write in our HTML in order to render a given component. So for example, if I want to render my main nav component, but I want to write it out as whatever, I could write, for example, whatever as my key, then provide a value of the main nav component. And what that means is in my HTML right here, I can write whatever, like so, and that will be my Vue component name, right? So we can give it whatever name we want to in the context of this app.vue component. But obviously, since it's generally not a good idea to give one component two names, you're typically going to render it in the HTML with the exact same name as it's actually named, because that just avoids the unneeded complexity. So what I'm going to do is provide it with a name of main nav, and I'm going to set the value of this property to be the actual imported main nav component that we have right here. So by registering this, we now say that the app component can render a main nav component somewhere in its HTML. You'll notice, of course, that we have a little bit of an Eslint violation, and if I hover my mouse over, it says the main nav component has been registered, which is great news, but not used. And Vue, of course, here makes sense. It says, hey, you've told app that it can do something with main nav, it can render it, but you're not actually rendering it. That's a waste of imports, and that's a waste of registrations. So obviously the next step is to take this main nav and render it somewhere in our template. So I'm going to remove our former h1, and there's actually several different ways that we can render a Vue component. We'll talk about those variations in the next lesson. But for now, the easiest way to think about it is no different than your typical HTML element. So if you have a div, we know that we have an opening div and automatically a closing div with the slash, right? Different elements work differently, but this is a very common thing. And for now, let's treat it this way for our main nav component. So we can think of main nav now almost like its own new HTML element that we've introduced into the app. And we're going to write it out the exact same way as we write any other HTML element. So we're going to open it up. We're going to write main nav. Then we're going to put a closing bracket. And you can see automatically the VS Code has filled in the second half for me. I'm just going to write it out myself just so we practice, right? We're going to start with almost our opening tag, like our opening div, but it's going to be main nav. And then we're going to provide the closing slash and main nav and close it. Now make sure the spelling here is the exact same as it is right here. So I have a capital M and a capital N, so I'm going to write it out this way right here. I'm going to save the file, And Prettier is going to add some additional things like commas here, but now we are rendering a single main nav component in app.vue. And what does main nav render? It renders a header with the text of main nav. So if I go back to my browser, now we have the main nav component appear right here. This is a tremendous success. We have gotten our app component to render our main nav component and thus render its main nav into our browser, right? Now here's the beautiful part of Vue and the idea of reusable components is that components can be reused often and repeatedly, as often as you need them. So for example, if I copy and paste this code below and just paste it 3 times and save this file and then go back to look at my browser, we now have 3 main nav components being rendered, which of course equivalently is 3 HTML header elements being rendered in our HTML, right? And obviously this is a very simple and stupid example, but the idea here is that now we can use components to create these reusable small chunks of business logic and the corresponding chunk of HTML, the corresponding chunk of the user interface, and then reuse them as often as needed, and even customize or tweak each one a little bit slightly if we need it to be somewhat different from the others. Right now, these are all identical, but the idea is we have a reusable chunk of code, almost like we've created a new HTML element that does something for us, in this case, render a header. All right. That's all there is to cover in this lesson. We imported our main nav component. We registered it with our app component by using the components key on the app components configuration object. We talked about the key here representing the text that's going to be rendered here inside the actual HTML. So again, if this is whatever, we would write whatever here instead. And the value for the property is going to be the actual component that Vue should render whenever we use this value. And then, of course, one other thing I, of course, forgot to mention is here we have a convenient use of ES6 syntax where our property name is the same as our value name. And if you're familiar with ES6, you know that you can actually simplify this down to this expression, which is going to be just the name by itself. This tells ES6, create a property with a key of main nav and associate it with some kind of name, like a variable or an import in your program that is also called main nav. So that's a little bit of a simpler way to accomplish what we just did, and that keeps the same result. All right, that's all there is to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one. In this lesson, I want to show you a couple different ways that we can render a Vue component within another Vue component. We saw one example in the previous lesson, and we see it on lines 2 through 4, but there are actually several options available syntactically in Vue. So I'm going to clear lines 3 and 4 here, which is my second and third usage of the main nav component. And I'm going to keep the first one just so we have it to compare. And what we see here, of course, is an opening tag and a closing tag. The closing tag is the same, except it has the slash at the very beginning. And the way this works is very much like an HTML element, like a div works. We have our opening tag, our closing tag, and sometimes we can put content in the middle, and we'll talk about why we might want to do that in Vue later on. But whenever we have no content inside, we can have a single self-closing tag. It's the exact same idea in HTML where we have something like an input tag where we do not need a complementary closing tag. We can just have a single tag, and we put the slash at the very end. So that syntax looks like this. I'm going to write out main nav again, but instead of writing both an opening and a closing tag, I'm going to put the slash at the end here and then the bracket to close off this component. So this syntax on line number 3 is equivalent to what we have on line number 2, and it should only be used if there is no actual internal content to place in between the opening and closing tags. So line number 3 is actually preferred because it's a little bit lighter and shorter, but it accomplishes the exact same technical result as line number 2, and I can prove this to you in our browser. We have now 2 instances of our main nav component being rendered onto the screen. But it doesn't end there. There's a couple more options available to us. So earlier in the previous lesson, we talked about this components property on our Vue configuration object, and we talked about the name that we defined here being available directly to use in our template. And indeed it is. We have main nav here. But Vue also takes this name right here and converts it into a couple different casings that we can also use in our template. One example is kebab case. So what we have here is called Pascal case, and that means the first letter of every word is capitalized, so the M in main and the N in nav. In kebab case, we turn the entire word lowercase, and then between every 2 subsequent words, we put a dash or a hyphen. So it looks like this. If you can imagine lowercasing the entire word, so main nav, and then instead of separating main and nav with capitalization, we separate it with a dash. All right, I'm just going to write an opening tag, and as soon as I put my closing bracket here, you'll see that VS Code will automatically populate my closing tag. This syntax is also valid, right? So we can't just choose whatever name we want here. It is still dependent on what we defined in our components object. However, Vue will take this and allow us to use this, or equivalently, the kebab case version of whatever we have here. So this will work as well. It is identical. And as you might have guessed, if we have no content within our tags, we can similarly use a kebab-cased single self-closing tag. So we can write main-nav, all lowercase with a hyphen in between words, and close it off with a self-closing tag, just like this. And if I check back in my browser, you're going to see that now we have 4 instances of the main nav component being rendered. And that's the beautiful part of Vue. Each component is an independent, reusable chunk of the user interface, and we can render as many of these components as we need. As always, the most important thing is consistency, and what I'm going to be using throughout the course is the kebab case version. So I'm going to be using what we have on lines 4 and 5, following again the rule of if we have any content to place in between the tags, we're going to use both the opening and closing tags. And if we have no content between the tags, we're just going to do this single version on line number 5 with a closing slash at the end. So I'm going to remove the first 3 lines here, and I'm just going to stick with main nav. Save this, so when I go back to my browser, I should see only 1 component being rendered. There it is. And the last thing I want to do to close this lesson off is to show you how this component is going to appear in our Vue DevTools. It's been a little while since we explored those, so I want to show you how that works. So if you are in Chrome, the way you can access your DevTools is you go to this little hamburger dot icon on the very top right, and then you can go to More Tools and Developer Tools. And before you click this, whatever operating system you're on, I recommend taking a look at the shortcut that you see here and memorizing it. Moving forward, I'm not going to go through the menu. I'm just going to use my keyboard shortcut to access my developer tools. All right, so here's my developer tools, and after we install the Vue DevTools, we should see a separate Vue tab right here. And when we load this, it's going to load our Vue app and show us all of the components inside it. And what we can actually do here is select this little bullseye icon, and that will allow us to click on a component on our page to select it. And I, of course, want to select this main nav component. As I hover my mouse over it, we can actually see the Vue component appear in that little box, as well as its height and width. And if I click on this, it doesn't seem like it's affect anything. Let me try to click components here and see if I can expand this. Let me try even refreshing the page. Sometimes there are errors. There we go. That's what I was looking for. So now when I refresh the page, you'll notice we have this app component, and we also have this little collapse icon right here. And if I click this down, you're going to see all of the components that are nested within our app component. And when we use the word nested, I mean that it lives inside it. So main nav lives inside of our app component. It does so because we rendered main nav within the template for our app component. So we call this relationship a parent-child relationship. Main nav is a child component being rendered within the app parent component, right? We are rendering it within. And in turn, main nav can render its own Vue components, and those Vue components can in turn render their own child components. And the Vue DevTools will show us that entire hierarchy all the way down, from the very top level component where our app kicks things off to all of the smaller components that it renders along the way. And of course, each time we use a component, it'll show up here in our DevTools. So if I go back to my VS Code and I, let's say, copy and paste this to 2 lines below, and I go back to my DevTools, you'll see now that we have the 3 main nav components appear in our DevTools. And as I navigate and hover my mouse over each option, we'll see the equivalent main nav highlight in the actual HTML right here. So here I am, and on the first one, here's the second one, and here's the third one. All right, that's how we can select or preview any of our components that we're rendering as children, and then later on in DevTools, we'll be able to adjust their configuration and see the immediate impact of our changes on the screen. That's the advantage of the Vue DevTools. It's like a debugging environment within our browser. All right, let's go back to our component. And the last thing I want to do to close this lesson off, of course, is return back to just one main nav component within app.vue, save this file, and that's all there is to cover in this lesson. I will see you next time. All right, in this lesson, we will add some custom colors to our Tailwind config. As we know, the Tailwind utility library provides us with many small CSS classes that we can use throughout our HTML to provide immediate styles to our elements. We saw earlier how Tailwind has classes for things like margin and padding and font size, etc. Well, Tailwind also ships with several classes for setting the color of things, whether it be the font color or the background color. But of course, there's millions of possible colors that we can use, so the Tailwind library starts with your basic default set of colors. It kind of gives you a very small color palette to work with. So for example, we have an available class in Tailwind called text black, and as you might have guessed, if you apply that CSS class to an element, it will make the text black. The issue with our project is that we are looking for specific styles and specific colors that are inspired by the actual Google career site. So in a real-world example, you might imagine that our designer at our company might give us the color scheme, and the colors that they provide are simply not going to be available by default in the classes that Tailwind provides for us. However, the beautiful thing about Tailwind is that it is really customizable. So in this lesson, we're going to add those custom colors to our Tailwind config file. And what's super cool is Tailwind will actually generate automatic CSS classes for us, and we'll be able to use them just like any other Tailwind classes throughout our components. So here's how it works. Let's open up our tailwind.config.js file. So here in VS Code, I'm going to use Command P on a Mac, but you can use Control P on a Windows computer to bring up the fuzzy file search. And I want to search for tailwind.config.js. This is our Tailwind configuration file. Earlier on, we saw how we could extend some of the options available in Tailwind. For example, we added the Open Sans font and merged it in with the available fonts in Tailwind. Well, we want to do something very similar here. We want to extend the colors that are available to use in Tailwind. So right here, after this font family object, I'm going to create a new property called colors, and I'm going to set colors equal to an object. And the way it works here is the key or property is going to be some kind of name that we'd like to assign to a color that we're going to be using in our project. So for example, here, I'll provide my key in double quotes just because it has dashes. I'm going to create a named color called brand-gray-1. We can imagine that the company is our brand, and this is our brand's gray color. And the reason I'm going to put 1 at the end is because in many projects you may have multiple variations of a color. You may have multiple grays or multiple blues, etc. So this is our first brand gray color. I'm just going to call it 1. All right, and the value that I'm going to provide is going to be the hexadecimal code of the actual color that I want to represent here. So the one I want to do here is going to be hashtag DADCE0. And you can see it's this kind of light gray color. This is an automatic feature in my editor that you may not have available, but it shows me the actual color that this represents. So what this means is Tailwind is going to look through all of its available possible CSS utility classes. For example, we talked about text black earlier, applying a black text. Well, now it's going to create a CSS class called text brand gray 1 automatically for us. So whatever we put here, it's going to append to its built-in styles. So for example, text for text, I believe another option is BG for background. So now we're going to have an available CSS class called BG brand gray 1. The idea being that it mimics the exact way that classes are named in Tailwind. However, it's actually our own custom names that we specify with our own custom classes and corresponding colors. We're going to see how this actually works when we apply it to a HTML element in an upcoming lesson. But for now, I want to add 2 more colors that we're going to need throughout the project. So I'm just going to add another key value pair to this object. The next one is going to be brand blue 1. We're going to have a common blue color throughout the app. And this is going to be hashtag 1967D2. You can see it's that blue color. Again, these styles are taken and inspired by the Google Careers website, so I am not a designer. I did not come up with these myself. I just took the corresponding styles and we're copying them over here. All right, next one is going to be brand green 1. We're going to have a green color in our project as well. And the code for this is hashtag 137333. You're going to see it's going to be this green. And of course, when I save this file, Prettier will do its work and add some extra commas, and that is it. That is all we need. And now Tailwind will have a bunch of utility classes such as text brand gray 1, text brand blue 1, text brand green 1 that we can use like any other Tailwind class in our project. Now, what I recommend you do, even though this is technically not required, is restart your project, because sometimes it takes a little while for Tailwind to register, and sometimes it misses the fact that we've made changes to our Tailwind config file. Not always, but sometimes. So I just recommend turning off your project. On my Mac, I just hit Control-C. On Windows, I imagine it's going to be Control-C or Control-D. Press it a couple times, or even close the terminal window if it doesn't work. But afterwards, you can go ahead and restart the project with Npm Run Serve. And of course, that will bundle and transpile all of your Vue assets, which is going to include our Tailwind config file. And that's going to allow us to register these new styles. All right. So now that we have these styles available in our project, we can start applying them in the next couple of lessons. I'll see you there. All right, so now that we've configured some extra colors in our Tailwind config file, we can go ahead and apply some quick CSS styles to our main nav. These next two lessons are going to be CSS focused, so I'm going to proceed rather quickly, but I am going to talk a little bit about what each Tailwind class is doing. So I've opened up my main nav component, and we can go ahead and start building out some additional content in here. So I'm going to remove my main nav text, and within my header, I'm going to place a div. And VS Code should automatically create the closing div. And by now, we should hopefully know how to apply our Tailwind styles. We can just provide a class to the div and use whatever Tailwind styles we would like. So the first one I'm going to add is fixed. What this is going to do is apply a position fixed, which means this element, our navbar, is going to be positioned relative to our viewport, to our screen. Basically, what this means is our navbar is going to stay fixed. It's going to stay in the same position at all times, even as the rest of the page is scrolled. We want this kind of fixed or kind of glued to the very top of our page. And in order to specify where we want this actual element to be fixed on the page, we have to provide some additional classes. We're going to provide top-0 and left-0, and this specifies that the fixed element, our div, will be placed 0 pixels from the top of the screen and 0 pixels from the left of the screen, which basically means the top left corner. We've kind of positioned this div to be fixed starting from the top left corner, and then it's going to expand out and down as much as the content inside it demands, all right? So then I'm going to add a wfull class, just like we saw in the previous header. This just makes the width 100% of the parent. I'm going to add a height of 64 pixels, which I can do with H16. You can see here in my Tailwind IntelliSense, it is 4rem or equivalently 64 pixels. And then one more class here, bg-white. This is automatically available in Tailwind. Tailwind knows that white is a common color, so it has a helper class like bg-white, which, as you might guess, makes the background of this box white. All right, so I'm going to save this. There's not actually going to be any changes onto the page just yet that are going to be visible, but when we go ahead and add some more content, which we'll do in the next lesson, we'll be able to see it appear. In fact, let me go ahead and look at my inspector right now, just so we can take a look at what it looks like. We can see the div is actually on the page right here with the corresponding styles. There it is highlighted in blue, and we're going to continue building out more content within this nav. This is going to be the box that's going to house our navigation. All right, so I will see you in the next lesson. All right, so let's continue styling our main nav in this lesson. I promise we're going to get to the Vue content very soon. So right inside my div right here, I want to add another div, and we're going to add some more Tailwind styles to it. So right here, I'm going to add the class. The first thing I want to do is to make this a flex box, and it's as simple as adding the style flex. I want to make sure in my main nav that the content inside doesn't overflow onto a new line. So I just want to use the flex box to orient my menu items eventually across, but I don't actually want them to break onto a new line. So I'm going to add a class here called flex no wrap, which is going to ensure that our content doesn't wrap onto a new line. Then I want to make sure this div has the full height of its parent. So I'm going to do the h full class. We used the w full class before. Now we have the h full class, which applies 100% height. All right. The next thing I want to do is to add some padding to the left and right side of the container but not to the top and bottom. And there is, of course, a bunch of P classes for padding in Tailwind, but as you can see, the P classes by themselves apply padding across all 4 sides of the container. Luckily, we have classes called PX and PY, and they relate to axes. So the x-axis, of course, means left and right. So the PX utility classes from Tailwind apply padding only on the left and on the right side of the box. So here I'm going to do PX8, which, as you can see here, is going to apply 32 pixels of padding on the left side of the box and 32 pixels of padding on the right side of the box. That's just going to ensure that our text content doesn't start immediately on the left-hand side. We're going to push it in a little bit. Then what I want to do is apply the MX auto class. This functions very similarly to what we just saw with PX. The X means the x-axis. So when we say x-axis, we mean proceeding either left or right. So what MX auto is going to do is provide a margin left auto and a margin right auto. And what this does in CSS terms is centers this container within the parent container. So we're just going to center this container. All right. The next thing I want to do is add a border, but only on the bottom of our main nav. And the reason is because on the actual Google Careers website, we only have a small gray line that represents the border of the nav. There's no other border on the rest of the container because it's the very top of the page. So it kind of blends into the start of the page on both the top, the left, and the right. But we do want a small border on the bottom to separate the main nav from the main content of the page. So how do we create a bottom border only in Tailwind? Well, it's pretty simple. We have a border class for border, and if we add a -b, there's a border b class that creates a border bottom width of 1 pixel, all right? And we can specify that we want the border to be solid with the border solid class. So we have a 1 pixel solid bottom border. And then the last thing we have to specify with the border, of course, is the color that we want, all right? So I can start typing border dash, and we have a whole bunch of utility classes for color that are built into Tailwind CSS. For example, we have border blue as an example, and you can see there's a wide variety of different blues that we can use if we wanted any of these blues to be our border color. But in this case, we don't want one of the pre-configured Tailwind styles. We want our brand gray 1 color that we configured in the Tailwind config file a few lessons ago. But as I mentioned back then, Tailwind is going to be super helpful, and it's automatically created a class for us called border brand gray 1, as well as the other 2 CSS colors that we specified. So notice here that our IntelliSense is reading our Tailwind config and can realize that we have these available colors now to use for our border in our project as well. So these custom created CSS classes function exactly the same as Tailwind's built-in classes. By customizing the Tailwind config file, it automatically generated those classes for us, and the syntax remains the exact same. When I was first discovering this, I thought this was a very cool feature. So here I'm just going to add border brand gray 1. So we're going to have a bottom border with this color. You'll notice we're going to have a little bit of a violation here, and when I save the file, we're going to see Prettier fix it. Because there's a lot of content on one line, what Prettier wants to do is just break it up across a couple lines, and that's what it does right here. Breaks up those styles. CSS classes are white space insensitive, so it doesn't matter how many spaces we put between them. So these kinds of line breaks are totally fine. All right. So the next thing I want to do is within my div, I want to put a hyperlink that's going to be our company name. The idea being is that we can click on our company name on the top left corner of the page, and usually the way that works on websites is you're taken back to the home page. So for now, since we don't know about view navigation, we're just going to make this a regular hyperlink. So I'm going to do an A tag here. I'm just going to make the href attribute set to /, which is kind of the root route or the current route. We're not going to worry about this for now because we're going to come back to it later. And then I'm going to just write my text here, and that's going to be my company name. You can actually put whatever you want in here. I'm going to call my careers site Bobo Careers, just to have a little bit of fun here. But this text is up to you. All right, and then we still need to style this actual hyperlink. So right here, I'm going to do the class, and I'm going to apply some more Tailwind classes. So I'm going to do a flexbox again with the flex class. I want to center the content of my flexbox vertically in the center, and I can do that with the items center class, which applies align items center. So typically a flexbox is going to distribute its items in a row format, and you can customize how those elements are distributed in that row direction, as well as how they're distributed in the column direction, which is the other direction, which we can do with align items and setting it to center. So this is going to center my text of the Bobo careers within the div. All right. Then I want to add h-full to make sure we have the full height here as well. And then I want to make this text really large just to announce to everybody that this is my site. So I'm going to add text XL. There are, as you can see, a whole bunch of different text classes available for the size of our text. I'm just going to do text XL, which, as we can see here, is 20 pixels. So I'm going to do this, save this content, and now as I navigate back to my browser, we can see that now we're starting to get somewhere. We have our nice little box on the page. You can see that we have the bottom border that's been created from our custom color that we configured in the Tailwind config file. We have Tailwind providing the styles of this hyperlink right here. We have it nicely distributed in the center, and we're going to align all of our menu items right here as well in the center. And of course, if I click this, we're just going to be taken back to the same page. The page is going to refresh, which we do not want to do generally because a Vue app is supposed to be a single page app. We, in theory, should never refresh because the page should dynamically remove and add HTML elements as they are needed. We're going to fix this hyperlink problem later in the course. For now, it's a good way to start, and it's a good reminder to us that we do have some kind of link that should be navigating us somewhere, right? And that really is all there is to cover in this lesson. We finally have our brand name on our page, and of course the next thing is going to be rendering our menu items and playing around with some core Vue features. So I will see you in the next lessons.